Heat pressed down on the frontier street like a lid. Dust rose with every boot. At the edge of the road, a folding table held 4 wide-brimmed hats. No one stopped, no one looked, until a shadow fell across them. A heavy boot kicked the table leg. Wood cracked. Coins scattered into the dirt. Ceramic shattered. Chinaman's. Trash. The woman knelt. Fingers trembling, she gathered each coin. No tears, no words. Then another shadow appeared, unhurried, silent. A scarred hand caught the elbow mid-swing. One small twist. The bigger man plunged into the horse trough. Water exploded. The street held its breath. Someone had just done the impossible, and behind the glass of the land office, a pale smile watched. The reeds came from the river. She had cut them herself, in the gray hour before sunrise, when the water was cold enough to numb her fingers, and quiet enough that nobody would see a Chinese woman kneeling in the mud with a knife. That was the part nobody understood. The cutting, the curing, the soaking, the drying, the soaking again. Days of it, weeks, sometimes, before a single strand ever touched the shape of a hat. Yulan Fong knew this. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. And still, every morning she carried 4 finished hats to a folding table on the edge of Ashfordflit's Main Street, and every morning the town walked past them, like they were rocks in the road. 4 hats, wide-brimmed, tight-woven, built to throw shade clean across a man's shoulders in country where the sun didn't ask permission before it burned you. Nobody wanted them. Boots kicked dust toward her table all morning. Not on purpose, except sometimes it felt like it was. Men in sweat-soaked felt Stetsons walked by without turning their heads. Women under parasols hurried toward the dry goods dyed store like her table was something to step around. Like she was something to step around. A single dime sat in the small ceramic bowl beside her hats. 1 dime. For a week's sitting. A week of smiling at faces that looked straight through her like she was made of glass. She did not touch the dime. She only looked at it sometimes, the way you'd look at a wound to make sure it was still there. 25 years old. A widow for 1 year. Since the accident at the Silver Ridge mine took Kai from her and left behind a plot of land north of town Rocky. Dry, worth nothing to anyone who looked at it and didn't know what was underneath. She knew what was underneath. Kai had told her once, in the last good winter they had together. He'd drawn it for her on the back of the deed in ink that had probably faded by now. A spring, north corner, ran all year, even in the dry months. She hadn't looked at that drawing in months. Couldn't. Some days, looking at his handwriting undid her faster than looking at his grave. So she sat, and she wove, and she waited for a town that didn't want what she made. There was a particular sound the reeds made, worked between her fingers, that Yulan had come to find as steadying as a heartbeat. A soft, dry whisper, reed crossing reed, building outward from the crown the way a spider built outward from its center, patient and exact. She had tried once, years ago, to describe the sound to Kai, and he had laughed gently and told her that a man who spent his days listening to pickaxes against rock had no ear left for anything so delicate. She thought of that laugh sometimes, working alone at her table in the slow hours before the street woke properly. It did not hurt the way it once had. It had become, instead, something closer to company, the particular kind of company grief eventually became, if a person was patient enough and stubborn enough to let it settle rather than fighting it every single day. She was thinking of it again. That same morning Roan Colby's shadow fell over Dutch and his soaked companion, and would remember later, with some private amusement, that she had been mid-thought about pickaxes and patient reeds at the exact moment the whole shape of her life in Ashford Flats had quietly begun to change. It was a rhythm by now, this waiting. She could have told you, without looking up, exactly which boots belonged to which man by the sound alone. The blacksmith walked heavy and even, like he was still swinging a hammer even when his hands were empty. The preacher's wife moved in quick, clipped little steps, always a half-beat ahead of wherever she was actually going. The bank clerk shuffled, the freight boys stomped. None of them ever stopped. She had names for some of them. In her head, though, she never said the names out loud. The woman who crosses the street early. The boy who waves and then remembers not to. A year of this. A year of learning the particular geography of being unseen. Her mother used to say a hat had 2 lives. The first life was the one you gave it with your hands, the cutting, the soaking, the long, patient hours of weaving reed over reed until the shape held on its own, without a single thread of cord to hold it together. The second life was the one the wearer gave it back. A hat took on the shape of the head that wore it, the tilt of a man's walk, the particular angle at which he squinted into weather. After enough years, a good hat stopped being something a person owned and started being something closer to a memory they carried around on top of their head. Yulan had been 8 years old, the first time her mother let her finish a brim on her own. She remembered the pride of it more clearly than she remembered most of what came after the fever that took her father, the crossing, the years of her uncle's crowded rooms in San Francisco before Kai had found work laying track east and asked her, in a voice too shy for a man 26 years old, whether she might consider a life further out, someplace with more sky in it. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. That was 8 years ago now, long enough that some mornings she had to work to remember the exact sound of his voice, and short enough that the effort of remembering still felt like a small private grief all its own. She thought of her mother's hands more than she let herself think of Kai's most days. Safer that way. A mother's hands were a country she had already left. A husband's hands were a country she had buried, 6 weeks married short of 2 years, in ground that still smelt of him some mornings if the wind came in from the north. In China, her family had made hats for 3 generations. Her grandmother's hands had shaped brims for merchants and magistrates, hard-crowned things meant to announce a man standing before he'd said a single word. Her mother's hands had shaped them for brides soft, pale, woven so fine you could nearly see light through the crown, meant to be worn once and kept forever. Yulan had grown up watching those hands, learning the weave the way other children learn to walk by falling into it, over and over, until falling stopped and walking started, and nobody could say exactly when the change had happened. Here, her hand-shaped hats for a bowl, with 1 dime in it. Here she was a curiosity, a shape at the edge of the street that people's eyes slid past without landing. The way your eye slides past a fence post or a rain barrel present, accounted for, never once considered. The heat sat on the town like a lid. It warped the air above the dust, made the far end of the street shimmer like something underwater. Yulan felt sweat trace a line down her spine and did not move to wipe it. Stillness was armor. If she showed nothing, the town could not see how close to breaking she was. Except the town did not see her at all, which was its own kind of breaking. The morning had not started with Voss. It never did. He preferred, she'd noticed, to arrive once the day's other small cruelties had already worn a person down a little. The way a good card player waited to see how much was already on the table before placing his own bet. An hour before he crossed the street to her, a boy of maybe 10 had stopped in front of her table, stared at the hats with open, unguarded curiosity, and reached out one small hand to touch the brim of the widest one, the way children touch things that catch their eye without yet having learned that some things are not meant to be touched by people who look like them. His mother had yanked him back by the collar so fast the boy had stumbled. "Don't," the woman had said. Not to Yulan. Past her, around her, as though Yulan were a feature of the landscape and not a person capable of hearing her own name left unspoken. Yulan had smiled anyway, had said good morning anyway, to the boys retreating back, because there was a stubbornness in her that refused, some mornings more successfully than others, to let the town's unkindness become her own. It was a small thing. It always was. That was what made a year of small things so much heavier, in the end, than any single large one might have been. A shadow crossed her table. She looked up, ready smile already rising, because that was the job. Smile first, hope second, and never let the two switch order. Harlan Voss. He owned the land office, held the paper on half the businesses in Ashford Flats and most of the debts that kept them standing, wore a fine wool suit in weather that should have drowned him in sweat, except somehow it never touched him, silver hair combed flat, smile sharp as a filed nail, eyes pale and still like a pond with something under the surface you couldn't quite see. "Afternoon, Mrs. Fong." His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of smooth that made you check your pockets after. He gestured at her hats with one gloved hand. Didn't touch them, just gestured like they were something on display in a case he owned. Still peddling the novelties. "They are very good for the sun, Mr. Voss." "I'm sure they are." He chuckled. Dry. A sound like paper tearing slowly. He picked up the smallest of the four, turned it once in his gloved fingers as though weighing it, and set it back down a half-inch off its original spot, close enough to look accidental and precise enough that it wasn't. "Fine work. Waste of fine work, on a corner nobody stops at." I do hope you sell one soon. The note on your husband's claim comes due in 24 days. He let that sit there a moment. 24 days. Like he was doing her a courtesy by saying the number out loud. Would be a shame, he said, to lose the last piece you've got of him. He didn't wait for an answer. Tipped his hat. Walked on down the street like a man moving through a town he already owned every corner of. Yulan's hands went still in her lap. He knew the dime in her bowl wouldn't cover a splinter of that note. He knew it before he asked. That was the whole performance, not the asking, the knowing. He had counted her coins the way other men counted cattle, casually, from a distance, certain of the number before he ever bothered to look close. The land was all she had left of Kai. Rocky. Dry. Worthless to anyone who didn't know about the spring. Losing it would mean losing the last place on earth that was hers. She watched Voss disappear into the saloon and felt the careful shell around her chest start to crack at the seam. 24 days. It sounded like a long time, said out loud in the middle of a hot afternoon. It did not feel like a long time. It felt like a held breath with a number attached to it. Ashford Flats had not been built so much as accumulated. A rail spur, a scatter of tents that hardened slowly into buildings, a vein of silver at Silver Ridge that drew in more hope than it ever paid out. The main street ran arrow straight for 200 yards before it lost its nerve and curved off toward the wash, as though even the road itself had grown tired of pretending the town was more organized than it was. From a height from the low ridge north of town where Yulan's own land sat quiet and unremarkable, Ashford Flats looked like exactly what it was. A handful of roofs, a scar of dust where the street ran through. A town that existed because a man with money had decided it should, and that answered, in more ways than most of its residents cared to admit, to that same man's convenience. She had come to hate that view, a little, in the year since Kai died. It made the town look small enough to hold in one hand. It made her own trouble look, from that height, like something that shouldn't have been able to touch her at all. Adeline Whitfield ran the dry goods store 2 doors down, and she was the only person in Ashford Flats who ever bought a hat from Yulan without being talked into it. She did it quietly, always at closing, when the street had mostly cleared, always with exact change counted out ahead of time, like she didn't want to be seen fumbling for coins in front of the widow. Always with a look over her shoulder before she spoke, like buying a hat from a Chinese woman was something that needed checking for witnesses first. Yulan understood the look, didn't like it, understood it anyway. Adeline had buried a husband of her own 6 years back and inherited a store with his debt still attached to it like burrs. Voss held the note on that store the same as he held notes on half the block. A woman alone, running a business alone, learned early which kindnesses she could afford and which ones she had to ration like water in August. You keep making these, Adeline said once, turning a hat over in her hands, admiring the tight weave along the brim. Somebody in this town's going to wake up. Maybe, Yulan said. Not maybe. Will. Adeline's mouth pressed thin. Takes them longer than it should. Always does. She paid for the hat, tucked it under her apron like contraband. And that was the whole exchange, a handful of words, wrapped and hidden before anyone else could see it happen. Yulan didn't blame her. Everyone in Ashford Flats owed Harlan Voss something. A note. A lease. A favor that had quietly turned into a debt nobody remembered agreeing to. Kindness in a town like that was a thing you spent carefully, like money you couldn't afford to lose. Adeline had not always been so careful. Yulan remembered dimly, the first year after Kai died, when Adeline had come to the funeral, one of only 4 white faces in a small gathering at the edge of the cemetery, and had stood the whole service with her hands folded and her jaw set, daring anyone to comment on her presence there. Nobody had. Not out loud. But word had traveled the way word always did, and within a month Adeline's own credit at the bank had tightened by a margin too precise to be coincidence. She had never spoken of it to Yulan directly. Yulan had pieced it together anyway, the way she pieced together most of what the town preferred to leave unsaid. I am not brave, Mrs. Fong, Adeline told her once, the same evening she bought that first hat under her apron. I want you to understand that plainly, so you don't go crediting me with more than I've earned. I am careful. There's a difference, and most days I'm ashamed of which side of it I've landed on. You came to his funeral, Yulan had said. That was not careful. Adeline had not answered that. Had only looked at her a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, before turning back to her ledger and changing the subject to the weather. Before the widow Perkins, for the Delgados, before any of it, there had been Yolande's own wedding 6 years back now, though some days it felt like 6 lifetimes. She remembered a borrowed dress, dyed carefully to the right shade of red, with tea and patience because there had been no money for silk. She remembered Kai's hand shaking as he tied the ribbon at her wrist, not from nerves exactly, but from a kind of disbelief that any of it, the small rented room, the 2 witnesses they'd scraped together, the whole improbable fact of a life, beginning in a country that had made it plain, in 100 small ways, that it did not particularly want either of them, and it was actually happening. We will build something, he had told her that night. In the dark, in the particular hush that comes after 2 people have promised themselves to each other and are still getting used to the shape of the promise. Not big, just ours. She had believed him, had gone on believing him through the crossing, through the crowded rooms in San Francisco, through the long, dusty stretch of railroad camps that finally spat them out, tired and hopeful in equal measure, at the edge of a town called Ashford Flats, that had a mine and a spur line, and Kai swore room enough for a homestead if a man was willing to work rock instead of soil. He had been willing. He had worked that mine 6 days a week for 2 years, coming home each night with silver dust ground so deep into the creases of his palms that no amount of washing ever fully lifted it out. And on the 7th day, every week without fail, he had walked the boundary of their claim with her, pointing out where a house might sit, where a garden might go, where someday, once they'd saved enough, a proper well might be dug. He had died before the well, before the house, before nearly all of it, except the one thing that mattered most in the end, which was the deed itself, and the small hand-drawn map on its reverse marking a spring he'd found and never told another living soul about, except her. Not big, she said sometimes, to no one, walking the same boundary alone now. Just ours. It still counted as building something, she told herself, even if she was the only one left to do the building. She was not the only one Voss had a hand in. Ashford Flats kept its grievances quiet, the way it kept most things quiet, but Yulon had learned to read the town's silence the way she read weather. There was the Delgado family, out past the north pasture, who had lost half their grazing rights to a boundary dispute that Voss had somehow always seemed to win, though nobody could ever quite explain how the survey lines had moved. There was old man Kessler at the feed store, who paid his note faithfully every month and still owed, by Voss's own careful arithmetic, almost exactly what he'd owed the year before. There was the widow Perkins, 2 streets over, who had sold her late husband's tools at a loss rather than fall behind on a lease. Voss had quietly doubled the year prices for hay collapsed. None of them spoke of it to each other. That was the particular genius of the arrangement, a town full of people each convinced their own bad luck was a private shame, when in fact it was the same hand dealing the same crooked cards to every table in the room. Yulon understood this without anyone explaining it to her. She had grown up watching magistrates in her grandmother's stories, men who wore their authority the way Voss wore his wool suit, as armor and as threat both at once. Half a mile past the edge of town, where the rail crews camped near the water tank, Bohan watched the smoke rise off his men's cook fire and thought, not for the first time, that Ashford Flats was a town built on other people's backs and other people's silence. His crew laid track for the spur line. Good work. Hard work. Paid in scrip that the company store cashed at half its worth, which was its own kind of theft, except nobody called it that because nobody who mattered had to live with it. He knew about the widow with the hats. Everyone in the camp did. A few of the men had gone into town once early on to see if she'd sell to them at a fair price one of their own, doing honest work, deserved better than the dime she was getting from strangers. She'd been kind, careful, and when they'd asked if she'd let them speak for her, vouch for her work to the foremen who bought hats for their crews, she had said no, not unkindly. Just no, if they know I sold through you. She'd told Bohan they will decide the hats are for railroad men only, and then no one else buys. He hadn't argued. She understood something about this town that took most people years to learn, and she'd learned it in a season. A hat worn by a rancher's son could travel anywhere in Ashford Flats without a second thought. A hat known to belong to the rail camp would never leave the rail camp at all. Still, he kept an eye on that corner of the street when his work brought him near it. Didn't know why, exactly, just felt like a thing worth doing, watching out for a woman standing alone in a town that didn't see her. He'd said as much to his foreman once, half joking. The foreman had laughed and told him to mind his own business, which in this territory generally meant mind the track, and nothing else. Bohan had nodded and kept watching anyway. The rider came into view at the edge of town in the worst part of the afternoon, when the heat sat thickest, and even the dogs had given up on barking. Yulan barely noticed him at first. Another shape moving through shimmering air, same as a dozen other riders that week. Except this one moved wrong. Slow. His posture bent with a tiredness that had nothing to do with the heat. His horse favored its left foreleg, stepping careful, like every stride cost something. The town noticed before she did. Conversations paused on the boardwalk. The blacksmith's hammer went quiet mid-swing. Because there was a way certain men carried themselves, a low-slung holster, an economy of movement that wasted nothing, and everyone in a frontier town learned to read it the way they read weather. He wasn't a rancher, wasn't a drummer selling tonics, wasn't anybody's idea of safe. He dismounted outside the livery, face shadowed under a hat that had seen better decades, crumpled, sweat-stained, brim torn along one edge like something had tried to take a bite of it. Spoke a few words to the liveryman, pointed at his horse's leg, then straightened up and looked down the length of the street. His eyes passed over the saloon, the general store, the assayer's office. They stopped on her. For a long moment, too long. She would think later, though in the moment it felt like no time had passed at all. He just stood there, 100 feet off, looking at her small table like it was the only thing on the street worth the trouble of looking at. She felt something tighten low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, something closer to bracing. Because men who looked at her like that, in her experience, either wanted something or wanted to take something, and there wasn't usually a third option. Except he didn't look dangerous. He looked worn through, hollowed out in the particular way of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had stopped noticing the weight of it. He reached up, pulled off his ruined hat, ran a hand through hair gone gray with trail dust, let the hat drop to the ground behind him like it had cost him nothing to lose it. Then he started walking. Toward her, the street held its breath. The waiting, as he crossed that last 100 feet, did something strange to time. Yulan found herself counting his steps without meaning to, counting the seconds between the fall of one boot and the next the way she might count breaths during a fever, checking for a rhythm that told her whether the worst had passed or was still coming. She thought, absurdly, of the story her grandmother used to tell about a magistrate's runner who arrived in a village each autumn to collect what was owed, how the whole village would go quiet at the first sight of his approach, not from fear of the man himself, but from fear of what his arrival always seemed to summon along behind it. This man summoned nothing. He carried nothing but a ruined hat dropped in the dust behind him, and a tiredness so complete it had worn every sharp edge off him. Except the street didn't know that yet. The street only knew the shape of him, the low holster, the unhurried stride, and treated the shape the way it always treated shapes like that. With silence. With space cleared wide and fast. Yulan did not clear space. She had nowhere left to retreat to that wasn't already behind her, and some stubborn, tired part of her decided, in the handful of seconds before he reached her table, that she would rather see clearly whatever was coming than spend one more moment of her life not looking at it. So she looked. And what she saw, up close, was not the shape the street had been afraid of. It was just a man, bone-tired, carrying something he hadn't set down in longer than she'd have guessed by looking at him. He stopped in front of her table, and his shadow finally gave her the first real shade she'd had all day. He was taller up close, leaner than the loose way he'd carried himself suggested, a jaw shadowed with 3 days of stubble, a face weathered the way rope gets weathered, not broken, just used hard over and over, until it held its shape no matter what. His hands, though, that was what caught her. The knuckles on his left hand, a webbing of old white scar tissue, the kind that came from being broken more than once and never properly set. He looked down at the 4 hats, said nothing, reached out one calloused finger, and touched the brim of the widest one. Traced the pattern of the weave, slow and careful, like he was reading something written in a language he half remembered. "This is good work," he said. His voice came out low, rough, like it hadn't been used in a while and had forgotten how to be smooth. It took her a moment to find her own voice. "Thank you." He picked the hat up, turned it over in his hands, checked the stitching along the underside of the brim, the way the reeds were joined at the crown, checking it, the way a man checks something he plans to depend on. Not the way a man checks something he plans to admire and put away. Then he put it on. A soft sound rippled through the boardwalk behind him, somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, because nobody in Ashford Flats had ever seen a man like that, wear anything a Chinese woman had made with her own two hands, not in public, not where the whole street could watch. He tilted the brim, settled it, looked at her from underneath it, his tired eyes shaded now by her weave. How much? 2 words. Flat. Not really a question so much as a formality he was moving through. $2, she said, and the number felt outrageous on her tongue even as she said it. He didn't blink, didn't haggle. Reached into his vest, pulled out a small leather pouch, untied it, and tipped 2 heavy silver dollars onto her table. They landed hard, a solid, definite sound that scattered the dust and made the lonely dime in her bowl look like exactly what it was, nothing. "I'll take it," he said. He gave her one short nod, like a door closing, and turned to walk back toward the livery. Left his old, ruined hat lying in the dirt behind him like a shed skin. The spell broke. A murmur went through the street. A rancher who had walked past her table a dozen times that morning drifted closer now, squinting at the remaining 3 hats like he was seeing them for the first time. "Say," he said, "those any good in the sun?" Before she could answer, another voice cut in from further down the boardwalk. "If it's good enough for Roan Colby, it's good enough for me." Roan Colby. The name moved through the crowd like a struck match. Heavy with a weight she didn't understand yet, stories, half-remembered, whispered, the kind of reputation that walked into a town ahead of the man himself. Yulan looked at the 2 silver dollars gleaming on her table, then at the back of the man wearing her hat, disappearing toward the livery. A man who had made her invisible town suddenly, startlingly, see her. She could not yet know what that seeing would cost. By the time the sun started sliding toward the ridgeline, the other 3 hats were gone. Men who had walked past her for a year without a glance now pressed coins into her hand and asked when she'd have more. A woman from one of the ranches outside town promised to bring her own reeds if it meant a custom order. The rancher who'd asked, "Are those any good?" bought 2, one for himself, one for his brother, because apparently that was how it worked now. If Roan Colby wore one, everybody wanted one. Even the bank clerk stopped, stood at her table a full minute, working up the nerve to speak, then bought the plainest of the 3, without a word of small talk, paid exact change, and hurried off like a man who'd stolen something. The rush lasted the better part of an hour, and Yulan would remember pieces of it for a long while after small, specific pieces, the way a person remembers the details of a single good day out of an otherwise gray year. There was the Delgado boy, 17 and gangly, buying a hat with money he'd clearly saved for something else, grinning like he'd gotten away with something. There was the schoolteacher, Miss Ainsley, who bought nothing but stood at the edge of the crowd a long while, watching, her expression unreadable, before finally walking on. There was old Kessler from the feed store, who didn't buy a hat either, but who stopped, for the first time in a year, to say good afternoon to her, by name Mrs. Fong, not the widow, not the Chinese woman, Mrs. Fong, and touched the brim of his own worn-out hat like she was somebody worth the courtesy. It was such a small thing. She would turn it over in her mind that night, the way another woman might turn over a piece of good news, checking it from every angle to be sure it hadn't been a trick of the light. Not every new customer that afternoon came easy. A rancher's wife named Constance Hale approached the table twice, retreated twice, and on the 3rd pass finally forced herself to speak, though every word of it seemed to cost her something. "I don't hold with buying from," she started, then stopped herself, some flicker of shame crossing her face at the sentence she'd nearly finished out loud in front of a dozen witnesses. She tried again. "That is, my husband says the workmanship's fine, whatever else a person might think." "It is fine," Yulan said evenly, offering nothing more and nothing less than the truth. "You are welcome to see for yourself." Constance Hale examined the hat a long while, turning it over with the same suspicious thoroughness she might have used on a horse. She suspected of hiding a lameness, found nothing to fault, paid, finally with the exact correct change and not one word of apology for the doubt that had come before it. Yulan watched her walk away and felt neither triumph nor forgiveness, only a kind of tired recognition that progress, in a town like Ashford Flats, rarely arrived wearing gratitude. More often it arrived reluctant, grumbling, unwilling to look you fully in the eye even as its money landed in your open palm. She had learned this past year to take the money anyway. Gratitude, she had decided, was a luxury she could not yet afford to require. Yolande promised to return the next morning. Her heart sat somewhere strange in her chest, half relief, half a feeling she didn't have a clean word for. Because relief was supposed to feel lighter than this. The money was real, tangible, a fraction of what she needed against Voss's 24-day deadline, but a fraction was more than she'd had that morning. Except the attention unsettled her in a way the dime never had. It was all because of him. Because of Roan Colby. She saw him again in the late afternoon, sitting on a bench outside the blacksmith's forge while his horse's leg was tended. He still wore the hat, tilted low against the light. He looked content to sit still, a man entirely at home in his own quiet. He didn't look like a killer, but she'd watched the way other men gave him a wide, careful berth on the boardwalk, the kind of respect that had fear stitched into its lining. Even the blacksmith, a man twice Colby's width through the shoulders, kept his eyes on his work and his voice low whenever he had to speak to him. The liveryman, a broad, unhurried man named Otto Graves, had plenty to say about his new customer once Colby was out of easy earshot, tending to the hat on the bench outside the forge. Man's paid 3 days ahead, Otto told anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen, which by mid-afternoon was most of the street. Didn't haggle on the horse's care neither. Didn't say much of anything, if I'm honest. Just handed over the coin and asked, would I mind the leg careful? You know who he is? Somebody asked. Roan Colby. Heard that name out of Elko Way, year or two back. Man cleared out a whole gang of claim jumpers up near the Ruby Range. Didn't lose a single man doing it, and didn't take more'n what the job was worth, neither. Don't look like much of a killer, Otto said, considering. Looks like a man who's had about enough of being one, if you want my read on it. Nobody argued with that. It settled over the street, the way most new information did in a town that size, quietly and completely, so that by supper time half of Ashford Flats would repeat it as though they'd known it themselves all along. Bohan heard the same story secondhand, from one of his men who'd walked into town for tobacco and come back instead with gossip. He turned it over a long moment by the cook fire, watching the last of the light go copper over the ridge. Man that's had enough of killing, he said finally, half to himself, is either the safest kind there is, or the most dangerous kind there is. Depends entirely what he decides to spend the rest of himself on. He said nothing further on the matter, but he found himself, later that evening, walking the long way back from the water tank, past the edge of Main Street, close enough to see for himself the shape of a man sitting quiet outside the forge, with a woman's hat balanced careful on his knee, turning it over and over like it was something worth guarding. He decided he approved. He did not decide yet whether that approval would matter for anything. She was folding her tablecloth, getting ready to leave for the day, when trouble found her. It usually did, right after Hope showed up, like the two traveled together on purpose. 2 men crossed the street toward her, big through the shoulders, the kind of big that came from freight work, hauling crates, breaking mules, doing the physical labor that men like Harlan Voss never touched with their own hands. She recognized them. Freight hands, often seen standing near Voss's office, running errands that never seemed to have anything to do with freight. The one in front had a thick neck and a mouth built for sneering. Well, well, he said. Look at the China doll. Finally made herself a sale. His partner laughed, ugly and grating. Heard that gunman Colby bought one of your little baskets. He shook his head. Mock sorrowful. Guess he ain't got no taste. Yolande kept her eyes down. Folded the cloth. Because she'd learned the hard way, over and over, that engaging with men like this only fed whatever they were hungry for. Silence was supposed to be a shield. Except this time, silence provoked. The thick-necked one Dutch, the other one called him once, though she'd never bothered learning his full name, kicked the leg of her table. Not hard. Hard enough, the table went over. Her ceramic bowls shattered on the packed earth. The coins she'd earned scattered into the dust like something spilled and unrecoverable. "Aw, look what you did, Dutch," the second man said, mock sympathetic. Made her drop her whole fortune. Yulon knelt, movement stiff, deliberate, because she would not give them her tears that at least was still hers to withhold. She started picking up the coins, fingers trembling faintly as they brushed dirt. This is the true shape of the town, she thought. A moment of kindness, always followed by something small and cruel arriving right on schedule. Leave her be. The voice was low, flat, not raised at all, which somehow made it worse for the men it was aimed at. She looked up. Roan Colby stood 10 feet away, hadn't moved fast, seemed instead to have simply arrived materialized out of the heat and the long shadows, the way certain kinds of trouble did. Her hat sat squarely on his head, brim low enough to hide his eyes. Dutch turned, spat in the dust. "Ain't your concern, Colby. Town business. You knocked over the lady's table." Colby's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "You'll pay for the damages. And you'll pick it back up." Dutch and his partner traded a look. A silent conversation made entirely of bravado and poor judgment. Dutch stepped forward. He had 6 inches on Colby and probably 50 pounds, most of it in his arms and gut. "Or what?" he said. "You gonna shoot me over a broke bowl?" Colby didn't answer. He just stood there. And that stillness, that flat-hatched, waiting stillness, was somehow louder than a shout would have been. Dutch mistook it for weakness. He swung. A wide, heavy fist aimed straight at Colby's jaw, telegraphed a full second before it landed, which turned out to be a full second too many. What happened next took maybe 2 heartbeats. Colby didn't draw, didn't even seem to move his feet. He swayed back a small motion, almost lazy, and let the fist pass a hand's width from his ear. As Dutch's arm overextended past its own weight, Colby's scarred left hand shot out. Not a punch. An open palm, catching Dutch at the elbow, and one small twist of his own body turned Dutch's momentum straight back against him. Dutch stumbled. Lost his footing entirely. Went headfirst into the horse trough beside the forge, the splash loud enough to turn heads 2 streets over. The second man froze, hand halfway to the knife on his belt. Froze there, because Colby's gaze had swung to him, and whatever was in that gaze made the man's hand remember it had other things it could be doing. "Pick up the table," Colby said again. The man scrambled to obey, righted the table with hands that visibly shook. Dutch clawed his way out of the trough, soaked through, spitting water, humiliated in front of a street that had gone dead silent to watch. Colby walked over to where Yulon still knelt in the dirt, crouched beside her, began collecting the scattered coins with fingers that were, against all expectation, gentle. Careful. He placed them one at a time into her open palm. She looked at his hands, doing this small, quiet work, and thought not for the first time that day that she didn't know what to make of him at all. The fight itself lasted only seconds, but the seconds leading up to it stretched long in Yulon's memory afterward, the way danger always seemed to slow time down to something a person could examine at their leisure, only once it was safely over. She remembered the particular quality of the silence that fell over the boardwalk as Dutch squared his shoulders. Remembered a woman nearby pulling her child back by the collar, not out of any concern for Yulon this time, but from the older, more familiar instinct to clear space around violence before it arrived. Remembered thinking with a strange detached clarity that she had knelt in this same dirt, collecting these same kinds of small humiliations for a year now, and that whatever happened in the next several seconds, at least this time she would not be kneeling there entirely alone. She had been wrong about that, in the end. She had not needed to kneel there at all, not for more than the length of time it took a stranger's open palm to turn a bully's own weight against him. But the thought itself, that she was no longer entirely alone in this, stayed with her, long after the trough had stopped splashing, and the street had gone back to its ordinary noise. Harlan Voss emerged from his office at the exact moment the street had finished holding its breath, his expression arranged into something meant to pass for deep concern. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, what is all this commotion?" He crossed the street with unhurried steps, polished boots stopping inches from where Yulon still knelt. "My sincerest apologies, Mrs. Fong. These men work for my freight company. I cannot imagine what came over them." He shot a look at Dutch and his soaked partner, a look with real venom in it, aimed at men who had just made a public spectacle of the operation he preferred kept invisible. "You will apologize to the lady and compensate her." He pulled a $5 gold piece from his vest pocket, pressed it into Yulon's hand, with a flourish meant to be seen by everyone still watching from the boardwalk. "For the broken bowl. And the trouble. It was theater. Everyone on that street understood it was Theater Voss, turning a mess he'd very likely set in motion into a stage for his own generosity, reasserting exactly who owned the ground beneath all of them. But as he straightened, his gaze crossed Colby's. For one flicker of a second, the concerned gentleman mask slipped. Yulon, standing now, saw it happen, watched Voss's pale eyes drop not to the holster on Colby's hip, not to his face but to his left hand, the scarred one, the one that had just with unhurried economy dispatched a man twice its owner's size. Something crossed Voss's face. Not simple anger, something colder, sharp. Recognition, maybe. Though recognition of what? Yulan couldn't have said. He mastered it in under a second. Smoothed his expression back into its usual polish. Tipped his hat toward her and toward Colby, with exactly the same courtesy he'd have shown anyone else. Do enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Mrs. Fong. He walked back toward his office. Didn't look back. Yulan turned to ask Colby if he'd seen it too, that flicker, that flash of something under the surface of a man who never let anything show. But he was already looking after Voss's retreating back, jaw set in a way that hadn't been there a moment before. Whatever had just passed between the two men, it hadn't started that afternoon. The sun bled orange and low across the ridgeline by the time Yulan finished repacking her table and led her mule toward the edge of town, where she kept her small cart tethered near the wash. She found Colby waiting there, not blocking her path, just present, off to one side, as though he'd known this was where she'd end up and hadn't wanted to crowd her while she worked her way there. He'd taken the hat off, held it now in both hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers. "Wanted to apologize, ma'am," he said. "Seems I brought you the wrong kind of attention." She set down the last of her folded cloth, looked at him properly for the first time since the fight in the dying light. He looked less like the thing the town whispered about, and more like a man carrying something too heavy to set down anywhere. "You did not bring it, Mr. Colby," she said. "It was already here. You only made it visible. Call me Roan." A pause. "Seems to me visibility's a dangerous thing in a town like this." "Being invisible is also dangerous." Her voice stayed soft. "But there was iron laid under it, and she let him hear the iron. It lets men like Mr. Voss believe they can do as they please." He was quiet at that. Considering it. Conceding it, maybe, though he didn't say so out loud. "Why do you stay?" he said, finally. "This place doesn't seem to want what you have to offer." The question landed somewhere old in her chest. Somewhere she didn't let visitors go. Not usually, not on a first conversation. Not with a stranger whose name half the territory apparently already knew and feared. Except something about the stillness of him, the same stillness that had made Dutch's fist swing wide and miss, made her want to answer honestly. "My husband is buried here," she said. "Kai. He worked the mine at Silver Ridge. Saved every cent he could to buy a homestead claim north of town." She looked down at her hands. He believed in this place, in what it could still become. She lifted her eyes to Colby's face. "It is the only thing in this whole country that is mine." Colby said nothing for a long moment. His gaze had gone somewhere distant past her, past the town, past the darkening ridgeline, to some place she couldn't follow him. Then, slowly, he raised his scarred left hand, looked at it in the fading light, like he was seeing it for the first time in a while. "I understand that," he said, voice thick with something that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Wanting to hold on to the one thing that's yours." He didn't say more than that. Didn't explain the hand or the scars or the flicker she'd seen cross Voss's face. Whatever the story was, it stayed folded up behind his eyes, the way her own grief stayed folded up behind hers. "This is good work," he said, instead, running his thumb along the brim of the hat one more time, the same words he'd said that morning, standing at her table, before any of this had happened. "Honest work." He looked at her, and something in his tired eyes held steady on her face, a beat longer than politeness required. "A man like Voss," he said. "He wouldn't understand a thing made with this much care." "You never told me your Christian name," she said, after a while. The silence between them had stretched long enough that filling it felt less like nerve, and more like simple honesty. "Didn't offer it, because it isn't much use to anybody these days." A pause. "Ma'am Yulan," she said. "Not ma'am. I have a name as well, Mr. Colby." Something in his face eased at that, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that she noticed the family resemblance. "Yulan," he said, testing the shape of it, careful like a man handling something he didn't want to drop. "Good name, it means. Jade orchid." She hadn't meant to offer that much. It came out anyway, in the particular loosening that came with a long day finally letting go of its grip on her. "My mother chose it. She said an orchid could grow out of rock if it had to. Didn't need soft ground. Just needed to be stubborn enough." "Fits," Colby said. "Simple. Certain. More than you probably want it to. Some days, I'd guess." She looked at him a long moment in the fading light. "Some days," she agreed, "yes." He nodded, slow, and looked back out toward the darkening ridge, and for a while neither of them said anything else at all. The quiet between them had stopped, sometime in the last several minutes, feeling like the kind of quiet that needed filling. It had started, instead, to feel like company. Yulan didn't answer that. Didn't need to. The dark was coming down fast now, purple bleeding into the last orange along the ridge, and somewhere behind them in town, the saloon's lamps were flickering to life, one by one. 24 days. She had 24 days to find $200 she didn't have, against a man who owned the Marshall and half the paper in town. And she had, standing in front of her in the failing light, a stranger with a scarred hand and a past that made Harlan Voss's mask slip for exactly one unguarded second. She didn't know yet what any of it meant. She only knew, watching him settle the ruined old hat back onto his own head and turn toward the livery for the night, that whatever this was, whatever had ridden into Ashford Flats wearing her hat and her town's fear in equal measure, it was not finished with either of them yet. Kessler was not the only one whose small courtesies added up to something larger than themselves that day. The blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Garrett, who rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time to anyone, made a point of nodding to Yulan as she passed his forge that evening, a small thing, the kind of gesture most people in town would never have noticed themselves giving or withholding. But one Yulan had learned, this past year, to catalog carefully, the way a prospector catalogs the smallest flecks of color in a pan of river silt. She did not yet trust that the town's shift was permanent. A year of being overlooked had taught her better than to build her hope on a single afternoon's worth of goodwill. But she allowed herself, walking home that evening with $2 in her pocket and a stranger's scarred hand still vivid in her memory, to hope a little anyway, carefully, the way a person tests ice before committing their full weight to it, but hope all the same. It was, she would think later, the first time in a year she had let herself do that, without immediately bracing for the disappointment that usually followed. Night came down proper before she finished the walk back to her rented room behind the washhouse, and Yulan lay a long while on the narrow bed without sleeping, listening to the town settle into its usual sounds, a dog barking twice and giving up, the saloon piano missing every fourth note, somewhere far off a coyote testing the dark. She thought about Roan Colby's hands, the gentleness of them, gathering her scattered coins out of the dirt. The scars on the left one, old and pale and deliberate looking, like a map of something that had happened to him more than once. She thought about the flicker on Voss's face. Recognition, she was almost certain. The look of a man seeing a debt he'd thought long settled walk back into the light. She thought about the number 24, and how it had felt enormous that afternoon and felt considerably smaller now. Lying in the dark, doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. $200. 4 hats a day on a very good day might bring in 8. She did not need a schoolteacher to tell her that $8 a day, even every day, even without a single bad week, would not close that gap before the note came due. She thought, finally, before sleep took her, of the hat itself, the first one, the one he'd worn walking away from her table that morning like it had always belonged to him. She wondered, in the loose, unguarded way thoughts arrive right before sleep, what kind of man carried $2 loose in a pouch and old scars on his knuckles, and stopped, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, to tell a stranger her work was honest. She did not have an answer. She fell asleep, still turning the question over, the way you'd turn over a stone to see what was living underneath it. Half a mile off, at the livery, Roan Colby was not sleeping either. He sat on an overturned feed bucket outside the stable doors, in the dark, listening to his horse shift and settle in its stall, and thought about a scarred left hand and a smooth, pale-eyed man who had looked at it like he was looking at a ghost. 3 years he had chased a name, Harmon Steele, a name that dissolved the moment you got close enough to touch it, that turned into some other name in some other town, before you could ever pin it down long enough to make it answer for anything. He had not expected, riding into a town he'd chosen at random off a worn map, to find that name wearing a fine wool suit and calling itself Harlan Voss. He had not expected, either, to find himself standing over a widow's scattered coins, picking them up one at a time, feeling something in his chest that had gone quiet a long time ago and had no business waking up now, over a hat and a spine made of iron, and a voice that stayed soft even when the words underneath it were not soft at all. He told himself it didn't mean anything. Told himself the same thing 3 more times before he finally went in to sleep, and did not believe it any better on the 4th telling than he had on the 1st. 8 days passed, which doesn't sound like much, except in a town the size of Ashford Flats, 8 days was enough for a whole new rhythm to settle in, the kind of rhythm nobody plans. It just happens, the way water finds the low ground without being told to. Yulon set her table up every morning now, same corner, and it didn't sit empty past 9. Word had traveled. If Colby wore one, folks wanted one, simple as that. Ugly, maybe, that it took a gunslinger's approval to make a town see what had been in front of them the whole year. But she'd learned a long time ago not to waste energy hating the shape a blessing came in. Roan's horse was healing slow, slower than the liveryman first guessed, which meant Roan stayed, which meant, somewhere in those 8 days, without either of them deciding it out loud, he started showing up at her corner most mornings before the heat set in, and most evenings after it broke. He didn't say much. That was still true, except the silences had started to feel less like walls and more like company. On the third morning, he fixed her table leg. She hadn't asked him to. Came out at dawn to set up and found him already crouched beside it, a length of scrap wood in one hand, testing the wobble Dutch's kick had left behind. Didn't ask for that, she said. Didn't ask for the whole town either. He didn't look up. Kept working the wood into place with a small hand plane he must have borrowed off the blacksmith. Seemed only right. She watched him work. Watched the scarred left hand move with a careful precision that didn't match the size of him. Big hands, rough hands, and still gentle enough to shave a wood joint down to a hairline fit. "You're handy," she said, not quite a question. "Grew up fixing things that broke." A pause. His jaw worked, like the next words cost him something to hand over. "Learned young there's not much on a farm that's fixed once and for all." She heard the word farm and filed it away. Because there was a story folded up inside that word. She could feel it, the way you can feel a stone in a shoe before you've even stopped to look at it. There were small rituals to it, this new rhythm, though neither of them would have called it that out loud. Most mornings he arrived before she'd finished laying out her table, and without a word exchanged, he'd take the water bucket down to the trough and back, so she wouldn't have to make 2 trips in the heat. Most evenings, once the last customer had wandered off, he'd walk the mule and cart the first stretch home, not all the way she'd made it plain. The second evening, that she could manage her own doorstep, but far enough that the loneliest part of the road no longer felt quite so long. She noticed the pattern of it before she let herself think too hard about what the pattern meant. A person did not spend 8 days arranging their whole day around a stranger's comfort without some part of themselves already having made a decision the rest of them hadn't caught up to yet. One evening, past the third day, she caught him examining her work table, the small collection of tools, the reed splitter, worn smooth with years of use, the awl that had belonged to her mother before it belonged to her. "You ever teach anybody this?" he asked, not quite looking at her when he said it. "No one left to teach." A pause. "There was a girl. Before, in San Francisco. My uncle's daughter, she had the hands for it. Didn't have the patience. Patience can be learned. Not by everyone." She glanced at him sideways. "Why? You looking to take up hat-making, Mr. Colby?" Something that might, in a less guarded man, have been a laugh moved through his chest without quite reaching his mouth. "Doubt these hands were built for anything that delicate. They mended my table leg well enough. Wood doesn't mind if you're rough with it. Reed does." He turned the awl over once in his fingers before setting it back exactly where he'd found it. "Figure I'd ruin more than I fixed." She let that sit a moment. "You might surprise yourself." He looked at her then properly, the way he rarely let himself do, and something passed between them that neither one named. "Might," he agreed. "Been surprised by less lately." They took most meals apart. Except twice that week, without either of them planning it, their paths crossed at the same hour, and it seemed foolish to eat alone at 2 separate tables 20 feet apart. The second time, she brought him tea. Real tea. From a small tin she kept for herself, and almost nobody else, because most of Ashford Flats wanted coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and had no patience for anything gentler. He drank it without comment, which she took at first as indifference, until he asked for a second cup. "You don't have to like it," she said, refilling. "Didn't say I liked it." A ghost of something crossed his mouth, not quite a smile, but a relative of one. "Said I wanted more of it." That is a strange way to compliment tea. Strange way to compliment most things. "Where I'm from." He turned the cup slowly between those scarred fingers. "We didn't have much use for saying things straight out. Said them sideways instead. Safer that way." Safer from what? He didn't answer that one. Looked past her. out toward the ridge, and the not answering told her more than any answer would have. Because that was the thing about Roan Colby, every piece of him she got sideways too. A word here, a silence there. A story with the ending cut clean off, like he'd learned exactly how much of himself he could afford to spend before it got dangerous. She understood that instinct better than most people would have. Which, she supposed, was maybe why she kept pouring the tea. Another evening, the fifth, though she was no longer keeping careful count, or told herself she wasn't, she asked him about the trail, where he'd ridden from. What kind of country a man saw, moving the way he moved, always one town ahead of wherever trouble had last found him. He answered more of it than she expected. Told her about a winter in the Bitterroots that had nearly taken his horse's legs out from under it, in a blizzard that came down without warning. Told her about a stretch of Utah desert so flat and so empty a man could watch his own shadow, shrink to nothing at noon, and swear the whole world had gone quiet just to spite him. Told her, in the careful sideways way he told her everything, about towns that had wanted him gone the moment they learned his name, and towns that had wanted him to stay for exactly the same reason. Which is worse, she asked, being unwanted or being wanted for the wrong thing? He considered that a long moment, turning his cup in his hands. Didn't used to have an answer for that, he said, finally. Lately, I'm starting to, and what is it? He didn't say. Just looked at her a beat too long, the way he'd started doing more often now, and let the silence answer in the particular language silences had begun speaking, unbidden, between the two of them. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she didn't mind the silence at all. One evening, near the end of that first stretch of days, Yulan found herself cooking enough for two without entirely deciding to. It was a simple meal rice, a little dried fish, vegetables from the small patch she kept behind her rented room, but she found herself taking more care over it than the occasion strictly demanded, and when Levi appeared at her door at the hour he usually did, drawn by habit more than invitation, she found she had already set out a second bowl. He ate carefully, the way he seemed to do most things, and when he finished, he sat a moment turning the empty bowl in his hands. The way he turned most things, he wasn't quite ready to set down. Haven't had a meal cooked by somebody else's hands in longer than I care to count, he said finally. That is not a compliment to my cooking. Wasn't trying for one. Or, he considered. Maybe it was, in the roundabout way I say most things. He looked up at her. It was good, Yulan. All of it. The food. The company. Longer since I've had either than I generally let myself think about. She took the bowl from him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, and neither of them commented on the small current that passed between them at the contact, though both of them felt it plainly enough. You are welcome at this table, she said. Quiet for as long as you find yourself in Ashford Flats, Mr. Whitlock. Might be longer than either of us was planning on, he said, given how things are shaping up. I find, she said, that I do not mind that possibility nearly as much as I might have 2 weeks ago. He smiled at that, a real one, unguarded, the kind she was coming to understand he rationed as carefully as she once rationed hope. There was a particular evening, somewhere in the middle of that first stretch of days, when a sudden squall rolled down off the mountains and caught the whole town unprepared, a rare enough event in that dry country, that half of Ashford Flats simply stood in their doorways watching it, more curious than concerned. Yulan and Levi had been halfway through packing up her table when the first heavy drops began striking the dust, and, rather than scramble for cover separately, they found themselves working together under the flimsy shelter of her table's canvas awning, laughing, actually laughing. An unguarded, surprise sound from both of them as the rain came down harder and the awning began, almost immediately, to fail at its one job. Ought to have built this thing sturdier, Levi said, wringing water from his sleeve. It has never once needed to survive weather before. Ashford Flats does not believe in rain. Ashford Flats is wrong then, same as it's been wrong about a great many things. He looked at her, soaked through and grinning in a way she had not yet seen on him, something young and unguarded surfacing beneath all that careful weariness. Might be my favorite thing about this town so far. How wrong it keeps turning out to be. They gave up on the awning eventually, gathered what could still be saved of her wares, and made a soaked, laughing dash for the overhang outside Adeline's store, where they stood dripping and grinning at each other until the worst of the squall passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the street steaming faintly under a sky already clearing back toward evening gold. It was, Yulan thought afterward, one of the finest hours she'd spent in this town, in longer than she could easily measure, not because anything of consequence had happened, but precisely because nothing had. Just rain and laughter, and a man who no longer felt like a stranger standing close enough to share both. Bohan visited Yulan's table directly, once, during those 8 days, a rare enough occurrence that she noted it particularly, since he generally preferred to keep his own dealings with the town quiet and indirect, mindful of exactly how much attention a Chinese foreman could safely draw to himself in a place like Ashford Flats. He came, it turned out, not to buy anything, but simply to see for himself the man his crew had taken to discussing around their cookfire with such curious frequency. "You are the one they call Colby," he said, studying Levi with the frank, unhurried appraisal of a man used to sizing up strangers quickly, out of necessity. "Some call me that." Levi met his gaze steady, offering nothing further, the same careful reserve he showed most people in those first days. Bohan seemed to find something satisfactory in that answer, or perhaps in the manner of its giving. He nodded once, slow, and looked to Yulan. "He treats you with respect," he said. Simple, as though stating a fact of weather rather than offering an opinion. "That is not nothing in a town such as this." "No," Yulan agreed, "it is not nothing at all." Bohan said nothing further on the matter then or later, but Yulan noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in how his crew spoke of Levi around their fire. Less curiosity now, more the particular, considered respect men extended to someone they had decided, after careful observation, was worth extending it to. Those 8 days carried their own small texture, beyond the growing quiet between Yulan and the man still known to most of Ashford Flats as Roan Colby. The Delgado boy came back twice more, each time saving up a little longer for a hat he clearly wanted more than he was willing to admit out loud. Old Kessler took to stopping by most mornings now, not always to buy, sometimes only to talk about weather, about the price of feed, about nothing of any particular consequence, except that the talking itself had become its own of small, steady kindness, the sort that cost him nothing and meant, to Yulan, considerably more than he likely understood. Even Constance Hale returned once, trailing a niece visiting from Reno, and stood by while the younger woman tried on 3 different hats, with an openness her aunt had conspicuously lacked on her own first visit. Progress, Yulan was learning, arrived in a town like this in exactly that fashion, not all at once, not evenly, but generation by generation, each one a shade less burdened than the one before it. She let herself, in those small moments, believe that whatever came of the note and the deadline, and the whole tangled business with Voss, something in Ashford Flats had already begun shifting in a direction it would not easily shift back from. The trouble started, as trouble in Ashford Flats always seemed to, with something small. His saddle strap had frayed near the cinch ring, and he'd asked to borrow her sewing kit, rather than pay the saddler's price for a job he could do himself in 20 minutes. She'd said yes. Set him up at the edge of her work table, while she finished a brim across from him, and for a while there was just the two of them working, companionable, quiet needle and reed, moving in their separate rhythms. Until his saddlebag tipped, he hadn't noticed, too deep in the strap work to catch it, and by the time Yulan reached out to right it before its contents spilled across the dirt, a folded paper had already slipped free and landed open at her feet. She bent to pick it up, meant only to hand it back, except her eyes caught the top line before she could stop them. A land contract. Ohio, the header said, dated 3 years back, and beneath the date a signature Harmon Steele written in a hand she recognized instantly, because she'd been staring at Harlan Voss's signature on notices and warnings for the better part of a year. Same slant, same flourish under the final letter. A man's handwriting doesn't change just because his name does. Her hands went still. "Roan," she said, quiet. "Who is Harmon Steele?" He looked up from the strap, saw the paper in her hand, and something in his face closed like a door, slamming somewhere down a long hallway. "Give that back." "Not until you tell me. It's mine." "So is the answer, I think." She held the paper against her chest, both hands over it now, because whatever this was, she wasn't about to hand it back until she understood what it meant. "This is Mr. Voss's writing. I would know it anywhere. It has haunted my table for a year." Roan set the saddle strap down, slow, careful, like a man setting down a weapon he'd rather not be holding when the next part of the conversation started. "It's an old debt," he said. "From before what?" "Before Colby." His jaw worked. Colby, isn't it? Isn't my name, Yulon. The sound of her own name in his mouth, plain and unadorned for the first time since he'd ridden into town, landed harder than she expected to. Then whose name is it? Nobody's. I made it up. Off a fence post I passed crossing into Nevada, a short, humorless breath. Real name's Levi Whitlock. She sat down across from him. Slow. Because her legs had suddenly developed opinions about staying upright that she didn't entirely trust. Tell me, she said. And for the first time since he'd walked into her life, wearing a hat she'd made and a name that wasn't his, he did. My family had a farm in Ohio, he said. Good land. Worked it 2 generations before me. My father built the barn himself, board by board, the summer before I was born. He turned his scarred hand over in the lamplight, studying it like it belonged to somebody else. Man came through in the spring of '80, called himself Harmon Steele, had papers, fine words. Convinced my father to sign a loan against the farm new equipment, he said. Better yields, the kind of talk that sounds like sense until you're the one holding the empty end of it. The contract was a lie, Yulon said. Quiet. Not a question. The interest was built to fail from the start. My father didn't know it till the second year when the payment came due and the number had grown teeth. Nobody warned him about. Levi's voice stayed flat, but something underneath it had gone raw. Steele took the farm, the house, the barn he built with his own hands. All of it, on a piece of paper and a smile. And your father died the winter after. Cold. Mostly. Some say heartbreak. If you believe men can die of a thing like that. He looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes was so plain it made her ache in sympathy. An old wound worn smooth on the outside and still raw as new underneath. I believe it. I watched it happen. 3 years, she said. You've been chasing him. 3 years, chasing his name, his face, any thread that might lead somewhere. A humorless huff. Man's good at vanishing. Good at becoming somebody new. The second the last somebody stops being useful. He shook his head slowly. I never thought the thread would lead me to a table full of hats. You knew, Yulon said, slow, the pieces sliding into place with a clarity that felt like cold water down her back. When you touched the brim that first morning. You already suspected, no. He shook his head firm. That part was real. I stopped because the work was good, because it reminded me of things worth stopping for. A pause. I only started putting the rest together after. The scar on my hand. The way Voss looked at it that day in the street. His mouth tightened. He remembers. Whatever else, that man's forgotten how to feel. He remembers exactly whose hand broke, against exactly whose jaw 3 years back, the night he came to collect the last of what he'd already stolen. Yulon sat with that a long moment, the paper still clutched to her chest, the lamp guttering low between them, the whole shape of the last 8 days rearranging itself into something new, and considerably more dangerous than she'd understood it to be. So he knows you, she said, and you know him, and neither one of us can prove a thing that would hold up in a courtroom. Levi's voice had gone tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. That's the trouble with a man who's good at paper. He leaves you plenty to be furious about, and nothing you can carry into a judge's office. She stayed sit across from him a long while after the confession about Ohio, the lamp burning lower, neither of them in any hurry to break the particular kind of quiet that settles after a true thing has finally been said out loud. Why, tell me now, she asked eventually. You could have kept it. Given the paper back and let me believe whatever story you wanted me to believe. Could have. He turned the empty teacup slowly between his fingers, studying it like it held an answer he was still working out. Didn't feel right, letting you go on trusting a name that isn't mine. Not after he stopped. Started, again, quieter. Not after you told me about the spring. About Kai. Seemed a poor trade, you handing me something that true and me handing you back a lie. That is a generous way of explaining it. Might be. A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite shame, not quite relief. Some cousin of both. Truth is, I'm tired of carrying it alone. 3 years is a long time to keep a thing folded up so tight it starts cutting into you from the inside. Yulon was quiet a moment, turning that over. My grandmother used to say grief carried alone grows heavier every year, she said finally. Grief carried together only grows heavier the first season. After that, it settles. Becomes something you can live around, instead of something that lives inside you. That sound like something you believe, or something you're hoping's true. Both, I think. A small, tired smile. Most things worth believing start out that way. He looked at her a long moment in the lamplight, and something in his exhausted face eased, just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. Well, he said. Guess we'll find out together then. Whether it settles. Neither one of them moved to end the evening for a while after that. The lamp burned lower still. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark, and somewhere off toward the ridge a nighthawk called twice and fell silent, and the two of them sat on, saying nothing further, needing nothing further said. There's another matter, Levi said, once the shock of the forged ledger had settled into something more like resolve. He reached into his vest, produced a small, worn notebook she hadn't seen before, its pages soft with handling. Been keeping my own record. Every town I could confirm he'd passed through, every name he used. It isn't proof of anything on its own. But laid next to what you found, it starts to look less like one bad debt and more like a pattern a man's been running for years. Yulan took the notebook carefully, turning through pages dense with dates and aliases: Harmon Steele, Cyrus Wren, Bertram Hale, each one crossed out once its usefulness had apparently expired, a new name inked in below. How many towns? She asked. 6, that I could confirm. Likely more I couldn't. 6 families. At least, his jaw was tight. Man doesn't stop on his own. Yulan, men like that never do. They only stop when somebody makes stopping cost more than continuing. She closed the notebook slowly, feeling its weight settle into her hands like something considerably heavier than paper had any right to be. Then we will have to be the ones who make it cost, she said. Levi looked at her a long moment, something steady and a little startled moving behind his tired eyes, as though he were only now fully taking the measure of the woman sitting across from him. Reckon we will, he said. Marshal Otis Pratt kept an office at the far end of the street, a narrow building with a single cell in back that mostly held drunks sleeping off a Saturday. He was a heavyset man, going gray at the temples, with the particular stillness of somebody who'd once seen a great deal of trouble and had spent the years since trying very hard not to see any more of it. He came by Yulan's table 2 mornings after the saddlestrap conversation, not on any official business near as she could tell. Just walking the street the way he always did, boots heavy on the boards, badge catching the early light. Except this time his gaze snagged on the man sitting near her table mending a bridle, and something in Pratt's whole body changed. Whitlock. Low. Almost disbelieving. Levi looked up slow. Marshal. Didn't expect to see that face again. Not out here. Pratt's voice had gone strange, not hostile exactly. Careful. Like a man picking his way across ice he wasn't sure would hold. You've got your daddy's look about the eyes. Startled me a moment. Yulan looked between them. You knew each other. Fought together, Pratt said. Simple. Flat. Bull Run to Antietam and points between. That cornfield outside Sharpsburg took men off both our companies faster than we could count them that morning. Your daddy pulled me clear from under a collapsed supply wagon in all that smoke. Carried me near 2 miles on a leg that was half shot itself. He shook his head slowly. Man like that doesn't deserve what happened to that farm. Levi's hands had gone still on the bridle. You know what happened. I know the shape of it. Same shapes happened to half a dozen men in this county one way or another. Pratt's jaw tightened. I also know who's been signing the paper on it lately, under a different name than the one he used up in Ohio. Then why, Levi said, voice low and hard now, does that man still own half this town? Pratt didn't answer right away. Looked down the street, toward the land office, toward the fine glass window Vucid Special from Sacramento. Because I owe him, Pratt said, finally, quiet, ashamed of the word even as he said it. My brother's debt, not mine. But it's my name on the note that covers it, and my house that sits as collateral. He looked up, and the shame in his face was raw and unguarded. A man in my position learns to look the other direction real quick. Whitlock learns it or loses everything he's got left. Nobody spoke for a moment. The street noise went on around them, a wagon creaking past. Somebody's laughter spilling out of the saloon, ordinary sounds that felt just then very far away. I'm not asking you to choose sides, Marshal Levy said finally. Good, Pratt said. Because I don't know that I could, right now, and live with either answer. He tipped his hat toward Yulan, an old habit of courtesy that seemed to cost him nothing, and everything at once, and walked on down the street, shoulders bowed under a weight she was only now starting to understand belonged to half the town, not just to her. Pratt did not go straight back to his office after leaving Yulan's table that morning. He walked instead down toward the edge of town, past the last of the buildings, out to where the desert opened up, flat and empty, and gave a man room to think without an audience. He stood there a long while, hat off, turning it slowly in his hands, the way another man might turn a rosary, and thought about a porch in Ohio he had not let himself think about in longer than he cared to admit. He had told Whitlock only half a truth back at the table, that he knew the shape of what had happened to the farm. He had not told him the rest. Had not told him that shape had a very particular, very specific outline, one Pratt himself had witnessed firsthand and never once spoken of to another living soul. Some cowardices did not announce themselves as cowardice. They arrived instead dressed up as brute, as self-preservation, as the simple practical math of a man with a brother's debt hanging over his own roof. Pratt had told himself that story so many times over 3 years that he had very nearly convinced himself it was the whole truth. Standing at the edge of the desert that morning, watching the heat already beginning to rise off the flats in shimmering waves, he was no longer entirely sure he believed it. He put his hat back on, walked back toward town, did not yet know what he intended to do, with the doubt now sitting heavy in his chest, only that it had, for the first time in 3 years, refused to stay quietly folded up where he usually kept it. Harlan Voss kept a second ledger in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a false panel he'd had built into the wood by a carpenter in Sacramento who had never once asked what the panel was for, because men Voss paid well learned early not to ask questions that might cost them their employment. The second ledger told a truer story than the first. Every note he'd forged, every name he'd worn before Harlan Voss, every town he'd left behind him, always one careful step ahead of whatever reckoning might have been catching up. He did not consider himself a villain, sitting alone in his office those evenings, working through the numbers by lamplight. He considered himself a realist in a world built entirely out of other people's naivety, a world that rewarded, generously and reliably, any man patient enough to understand that most people would rather believe a comfortable lie than sit with an uncomfortable truth. The widow troubled him more than he cared to admit. Not because of the deed, which he could have handled a dozen quieter ways if he'd chosen to, because of the gunslinger standing beside her, wearing a scarred hand Voss recognized in his bones before his mind had finished catching up to the recognition. Levi Whitlock. He'd made a point, those first nights after the boy's arrival, of not saying the name aloud even to himself, as though saying it might summon something he wasn't yet prepared to face. He closed the second ledger, locked the false panel, told himself, as he always did, that he still held every card that mattered in this particular game. He did not entirely believe himself, and that unfamiliar uncertainty was, in its own quiet way, more unsettling to him than anything Yulan Fong had said or done since the day he first mentioned her husband's note. Voss's countermove arrived 3 days later, and it arrived quiet, which Yulan was learning was always how his moves arrived. Loud men used fists. Voss used paper and rumor and time. A new table appeared across the street from hers on a Tuesday morning. A woman she didn't recognize, fine dress, practiced smile, an accent that placed her somewhere back east, laid out a spread of hats twice the size of Yulan's, priced half again as cheap. Ottilie Vance. The woman introduced herself when Yulan crossed to look. Carson City, by way of Philadelphia. Mr. Voss was kind enough to help me find a spot in town. Kind enough. Yulan turned the phrase over like a coin, checking both sides for the counterfeit. Underneath, the hats were pretty, machine-stitched, factory reeds, none of the careful hand joinery that made Yulan's work last 3 seasons instead of one. But pretty sold, sometimes especially to folks who'd never had to sit under a real Nevada sun in a hat that didn't hold its shape. By Thursday, half of Yulan's morning customers had drifted across the street instead. Ottilie Vance was not, it turned out, entirely comfortable in the arrangement Voss had built for her. Yulan noticed it first in small things, the way the woman's smile faltered when Voss himself came by to check on her table. Quick and businesslike, more landlord than benefactor. The way she'd taken to closing up early some afternoons, her hats only half sold, as though she couldn't quite stomach a full day of the work. They spoke only once that week, briefly, when a sudden gust knocked one of Ottilie's display hats into the street and Yulan, without quite deciding to, crossed over to help retrieve it. "You needn't have," Ottilie said, taking the hat back with a stiffness that wasn't unkindness so much as embarrassment. "It was in the road," Yulan said simply. "Anyone would have." Ottilie studied her a moment, something uncertain moving behind her eyes. "Mr. Voss tells me you and I are in competition, Mrs. Fong. I confess I don't much care for the framing. Back in Philadelphia, competition meant two shops both doing honest work and letting the customer decide. This feels rather more like being handed a knife and told to make use of it. Then perhaps it isn't competition at all, Yulan said, carefully. Perhaps it is simply Mr. Voss, using two women to do a thing he'd rather not be seen doing himself. Something flickered across Adelie's face, not quite agreement, but not quite denial either. I have a note of my own with that man, she said, finally quiet, almost to herself. Came due before I ever left Carson City. This arrangement was how he offered to forgive the balance. She set the fallen hat back on its stand, adjusting it with more care than the moment strictly required. I did not ask many questions at the time. I have begun to wonder if that was a mistake. She said nothing further, but she held Yulan's gaze a beat longer than courtesy required, before turning back to her own table, and Yulan walked away with the distinct, unsettling sense that Ottilie Vance's loyalty to Harlan Voss was considerably thinner than he likely believed it to be. Voss found Ottilie Vance at her table. On the same afternoon, the whispers about Yulan's deed had begun making their rounds, and something in his manner that day carried less of its usual polish than she had grown accustomed to. Business seems slower than I'd hoped, Miss Vance. His voice stayed pleasant. His eyes did not. I trust you remember the terms of our arrangement. I remember them plainly, Mr. Voss. She kept her own voice light, though something careful had entered it. I have sold a good number of hats this week. More than the widow, by most counts. See that the counts continue in that direction. He picked up one of her hats, turned it over with the same idle proprietary motion Yulan had once watched him use on her own table, and set it back down slightly askew. I did not bring you 200 miles to watch you grow sentimental over a competitor, Miss Vance. Sentiment is an expensive habit. I'd hate to see you discover just how expensive. He walked on without waiting for a reply, and Ottilie stood a long moment at her table afterward, straightening the hat he'd disturbed with hands that were not quite steady. She had come to Ashford Flats believing herself Voss's business partner, however unequal. Standing there in the wake of his visit, she understood, with a clarity that settled cold and unpleasant in her chest, that she had never been anything of the kind. She had simply been another debt he intended to collect, dressed up in finer language than the one he'd used on the widow, but a debt all the same. Voss noticed the change in Marshall Pratt before almost anyone else did, which was, perhaps, unsurprising in a man who had built his entire fortune on noticing small shifts in other people's behavior before they noticed such shifts themselves. Pratt had always been reliable in a particular, useful way, a man who did what was asked of him, and asked few questions in return, so long as his brother's debt remained quietly, safely covered. Watching him on the street those days, Voss saw something new in the marshal's bearing. A stiffness, a hesitation, in the half-second before he tipped his hat to passers-by, as though some private argument were running constantly beneath the surface of him now. One Voss could not quite read, but did not entirely like the shape of. He considered briefly, reminding Pratt directly of exactly whose signature covered his brother's note, decided against it for the moment. A threat spoken too early sometimes taught a man exactly how much he had left to lose, and Voss preferred his leverage kept quiet, implicit, felt rather than spoken. A debt was always more effective as a shadow a man lived under than as a weapon waved openly in his face. Still, he made a note, in the private ledger only he ever saw, to keep a closer watch on the marshal in the days ahead. Some instinct, honed over years of exactly this kind of quiet vigilance, told him that whatever unease had settled into Otis Pratt's shoulders lately, it was not going to resolve itself in Voss's favor without careful management. He did not yet imagine how right that instinct would prove to be. That same week the whisper started. Not loud. Never loud. That wasn't Voss's method. Just a word dropped here, a raised eyebrow there. Questions about whether a widow, and a Chinese widow at that, had any real claim to land her husband had purchased, given the new federal rules about who could own what and where. The Exclusion Act had passed the year before, and while it said nothing at all about property already held, that never stopped a rumor from wearing the shape of law when it was convenient for somebody to let it. Heard the deed might not hold up. A man muttered outside the dry goods store, loud enough for Yulan to catch it on her way past. Times being what they are, the whispers, once they started, found more soil to root in than Yulan would have liked. She heard it from the boy who swept the saloon floor, repeating something he'd overheard, without understanding its weight. She heard it from a rancher's wife who meant it kindly, in her own clumsy way, warning Yulan that she ought to see a lawyer about her deed before the talk got any further out ahead of her. She heard it, worst of all, From a woman she'd sold 3 hats to that very week, who crossed the street rather than pass close enough to speak. None of it was new. Exactly. She had spent a year absorbing the town's low hum of suspicion, the sense that her presence here was tolerated rather than welcomed, permitted rather than deserved. What was new was the shape the suspicion had taken, now no longer vague, no longer just the old familiar distance, but something with an edge to it, something aimed. She understood, turning it over that night, exactly what Voss had done. He had not needed to prove anything. He had only needed to make the question exist, loud enough and often enough, that even people who liked her, even people who bought her hats and greeted her by name, would begin to wonder, in some small unexamined corner of themselves, whether the wondering itself might be justified. That was the particular cruelty of it. A rumor did not need to be believed to do its work. It only needed to be repeated. Adeline spent the 2 days before the false arrest working a quieter angle of her own, one she hadn't yet mentioned to Yulan. She called in a favor from Mrs. Halloran, who ran the boarding house and had, over the years, developed a reputation as the single best-informed woman in Ashford Flats, not through any particular cleverness, but through the simple accident of overhearing nearly every private conversation the town's traveling men ever had over her breakfast table. Voss has been asking after freight rates to Sacramento, Mrs. Halloran told her, quiet, over the counter of the dry goods store, glancing once toward the door before continuing. Asked careful, mind, like a man not wanting the asking itself noticed. But I've fed enough drummers and land agents through my table to know the particular shape of a man testing an exit before he needs one. Adeline turned that information over a long while after Mrs. Halloran left. Did not yet know what to do with it, only that it confirmed something she'd already begun to suspect, that, whatever confidence Voss projected on the street, some quieter part of him had already begun preparing for the possibility that Ashford Flats might, eventually, stop being safe ground for a man built entirely out of other people's stolen foundations. She kept the information close, turning it over like a coin whose true value she hadn't yet worked out, waiting for the moment it might be spent to best effect. She kept walking, kept her spine straight, because if she stopped to argue every whisper in Ashford Flats, she'd never do another day's work again. Except that night, alone in her small rented room behind the washhouse, she let herself sit with how much the whisper had frightened her. Not because it was true, because she understood now exactly the kind of man capable of turning an untrue thing into a weapon simply by saying it often enough to enough people in a town that already wanted a reason to look away from her. She went looking through his papers that night. Hadn't opened the small wooden box in months, couldn't, most days, without his handwriting undoing something in her chest she wasn't ready to have undone. Except now she had a reason bigger than her own grief. She found the ledger near the bottom. Kai's accounts, kept meticulous the way he kept everything. Every dollar earned at the mine logged against every dollar spent, right up until the week of the accident, and near the back, folded separate from the rest, the loan paperwork. The note was held against the land. She read it 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. The number in Kai's careful hand, the number he'd copied down the day he signed, did not match the number on Voss's most recent notice. Not by a little. By enough that the difference alone could have covered half of what Voss now claimed she owed. Someone had changed it, after the fact, in a hand that, on close inspection under her lamp, didn't quite match the rest of the document, a hair too careful, too recent, ink gone a shade darker than the faded lines around it. Her hands were shaking by the time she set the papers down. She read through the rest of Kai's ledger before she finally closed the box that night, and found herself lingering longer than she meant to over pages that had nothing to do with Voss at all. His handwriting, small and careful, recording the ordinary texture of a life she had not let herself look at closely in a long while. Wages from the mine tallied to the penny. A note about repairing a wagon wheel. 3 separate entries, months apart, each one simply reading Spring North Corner Good Water, as though he'd gone back to check on it periodically, the way another man might check on a promise he'd made, and wanted to be sure was still being kept. She traced her finger over one of those entries a long moment. I am still keeping it, she said quietly, to the empty room, to the ledger, to whatever part of him might still be listening. I promise you that. She closed the box before the grief could pull her all the way under, and turned back to the forged document with hands that had steadied somewhat in the handling of something older and gentler than fraud. Because she thought. Because this was proof. Real proof. The kind Levi had said Voss never left behind. Except proof didn't mean anything if nobody with power was willing to look at it. She brought it to Levi the next morning and watched his face change as he read it. He forged this, Levi said. Quiet. Certain. Can you tell? I've spent 3 years staring at that man's handwriting on documents that ruined my family. His jaw was tight. I'd know his hand blind. Then we have something. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Something real, something a judge could what? Levi's tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. Ashford Flats doesn't have a judge, Yulon. It has Marshall Pratt, who's mortgaged up to his eyebrows to the very man we'd be accusing. And it has whatever state court sits 4 days' ride from here, assuming they'd even hear a claim from. He stopped himself, didn't finish it, didn't need to. From a Chinese widow was the rest of that sentence, and they both knew it, and neither one of them wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Then what do we do, she said. We wait, Levi said. We gather more. And when we've got enough that even a rigged table can't ignore it, we bring it to the one place in this whole stretch of country that still has to answer to somebody bigger than Harlan Voss. And until then, we don't let him see we've got anything at all. They should have been more careful. That was the thought that came to her later, after the useless kind of thought that arrives only once it's too late to do anything with it. Because 2 days after she found the ledger, on a morning that started ordinary as any other, everything came apart at once. Looking back on it later, Yulon would remember that the morning of the arrest had felt wrong before anything actually happened, a wrongness she hadn't been able to name at the time. The way animals are said to sense a storm hours before the sky gives any visible sign of one coming. Voss had not come by her table that morning, which was itself unusual. Some part of him seemed to enjoy the small ritual of his visits too much to skip one without reason. The street had felt thinner than usual, fewer women out with their baskets, fewer idle conversations drifting between the shop fronts. She had noticed it and dismissed it, the way a person dismisses most small wrongnesses in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day, filing it away as nothing worth the worry. She thought of that dismissal often in the days that followed, wondered whether some sharper version of herself might have read the signs correctly and found some way to stop what came next before it started. She knew, even as she wondered it, that the wondering itself was exactly the kind of trap Adeline had warned her against, the particular cruelty of hindsight, insisting a person should have known what only became visible after the fact. Still, the knowing did not entirely stop the wondering. Grief and guilt, she was learning, kept remarkably similar company. It started with a shout from outside the saloon. Yulon was 3 tables down, hauling water for the mule, when she heard it, a man's voice, pitched loud and wounded, calling for help, calling Levi's name with an accusation wrapped around it like barbed wire. She got there in time to see the aftermath, not the cause. A stranger she didn't recognize sat sprawled in the dirt outside the saloon, one hand pressed dramatically to a bloodied lip, pointing up at Levi with the other. He hit me, the man was saying, to anyone who'd listen, to the small crowd already gathering. Unprovoked. I was just standing here, and he come at me swinging. That's a lie, Levi said. Flat. I never touched him, except the man was already crying out for the marshal, and Marshal Pratt was already coming down the street at a heavy run, and Yulon understood with a clarity that felt like the floor dropping out from under her, exactly whose hand had arranged this, and exactly how little it mattered that it was a lie. The crowd that gathered around the false accusation grew faster than such crowds usually did, drawn by the particular magnetism of trouble involving a man whose name half the county already knew. Yulon pushed through the edge of it in time to hear the stranger's voice climb higher, more theatrical with each repetition, playing to the audience now rather than to Marshal Pratt. She recognized, with a cold, sinking clarity, the particular quality of a performance, the same quality Voss himself brought to every public gesture, generosity and outrage alike, always calibrated for an audience rather than for truth. Somebody ought to search him, the stranger was saying, working the crowd now, before he goes drawing on the marshal too. That's enough, Pratt said, sharp, cutting through the noise before it could curdle into something uglier. I heard the complaint. I'll handle it proper. Rest of you have somewhere else to be. The crowd didn't disperse so much as loosen, the way crowds did when the promised violence failed to arrive on schedule, though plenty of eyes stayed fixed on Levi as Pratt led him away, some curious, some wary few, Yulin noted with a small, cold anger, faintly satisfied, as though a gunslinger's fall from grace was simply the natural order of things reasserting itself. She caught the eye of the rancher who'd bought 2 hats that first day. He looked away first, uncomfortable, unwilling to meet her gaze in front of the gathered street. She understood. She had spent a year learning exactly how much courage it took a person in this town to be seen standing on the wrong side of Harlan Voss's opinion, and she did not, in that moment, have the strength left to be angry at a man for not yet possessing more of it than he did. "I have to arrest you," Pratt said when he reached them. His eyes carried an apology his mouth couldn't afford to speak out loud. "Man's making a formal complaint, witnesses backing him." "Bought witnesses," Levi said. "Maybe." Pratt's jaw worked. "Doesn't change what I have to do, Whitlock. Not with things standing the way they're standing." He held out a hand low, almost gentle, for the weapon at Levi's hip. "I am sorry. I want you to know that. For whatever it's worth from a man in my position." Levi looked at Yulon. One long, steady look over the heads of the gathering crowd, over the stranger still theatrically clutching his bloodied mouth in the dirt. "It's worth something," he said to Pratt, though his eyes never left Yulon's face. "Just not enough." He handed over his gun. Let himself be led toward the narrow jailhouse at the end of the street. Voss watched the whole thing from the window of his office, and even from that distance, across the whole width of the street, Yulon could see him smiling. 9 days left on the note. Levi Whitlock sat behind bars on a lie built out of a bloodied lip and a paid mouth, and the one man in Ashford Flats who might have stood beside her when Voss came to collect the land was now exactly where Voss wanted him locked up, silenced, entirely out of the way. Yulon stood in the middle of the street a long while after the jailhouse door swung shut, feeling something in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but sat somewhere close kin to both of them. She thought of the dime in her bowl, a year ago, of how long she'd sat still and small, and hoped the town would eventually see her on its own, without her ever having to make a sound. That woman, she thought, would have gone home tonight and wept, and woken tomorrow, and sat quiet at her table again, waiting. She was not that woman anymore. Word of the arrest moved through Ashford Flats the way word always moved, and by the time Yulon made her way from the jailhouse to Adeline's store, she had already noticed, in small ways scattered along her route, that not everyone in town had decided to look away. Old Kessler stood in the doorway of the feed store as she passed, and though he said nothing, he touched the brim of his hat to her the same small courtesy he'd offered the day of the rush, deliberate and unmistakable, a wordless declaration that he, at least, had not changed his opinion of her on account of a stranger's bloodied lip. A woman she barely knew, one of the ranch wives from out past the Delgado place, pressed a small paper packet into her hand without breaking stride. Yulon opened it later to find a few precious ounces of real coffee, the good kind, worth more just then than its weight would have suggested, along with a scrap of paper reading, in careful, uneven handwriting, "Whatever you need, ask. Small things." She told herself that walking on, the way she'd told herself the same thing 100 times this past year. Small things that added together were beginning to weigh rather more than any single dime ever had. She found Adeline Whitfield closing up the dry goods store, pulling the shade down over the window with the particular tiredness of a woman who'd spent all day pretending not to have heard what happened at the jailhouse. "They arrested him," Yulon said. No preamble. "I heard." Adeline didn't look up from the lock. "Whole street heard." It was a lie. Voss paid for it. I don't doubt it for a second. Adeline finally turned, and something in her face had shifted from its usual careful caution into something harder, something that had maybe been building in her a long while, under the surface, waiting for a reason to show itself. "Question is what you intend to do about a thing like that, Mrs. Fong. Because standing in the street being right about it won't move a single stone." Yulon straightened. "I intend to make it cost him something," she said. "More than he thinks he can afford to pay." For the first time since Yulon had known her, Adeline Whitfield smiled a real smile, not the careful, over-the-shoulder kind she usually spent on Yulon's hats. "Well," she said, "it's about time somebody in this town said that out loud." "Sit," Adeline said, once Yulon had finished explaining, gesturing to the stool behind the counter, with the brisk authority of a woman who did not intend to be argued with. "You've been standing in that street since it happened, I'd wager, working yourself up into something that isn't going to help either one of you." Yulon sat. Hadn't realized. until her legs finally gave up the argument. How much of the day she'd spent holding herself upright through sheer stubbornness. I keep thinking, she said, that if I had been more careful, if we had waited longer, before— Don't. Adeline's voice was firm, not unkind. That kind of thinking is a trap, Mrs. Fong, and a man like Voss built it on purpose, same as he builds everything else. He wants you doubting your own good sense, wants you small and second-guessing, because a woman busy blaming herself isn't a woman making trouble for him. Yulan looked up at that. Adeline's mouth had gone tight, some old grievance surfacing behind her eyes that had nothing directly to do with the matter at hand. Watched my own husband do something similar to himself, near the end, though the fault wasn't Voss's doing that time. Man convinces himself he's the reason for every hardship that lands on him, and pretty soon he's too tired fighting his own conscience to fight the thing that's actually doing him harm. She shook her head. I won't watch you walk Thame Road. Not while I've got breath to stop you. Thank you, Yulan said. Full, don't thank me yet. Adeline managed something that was almost a smile. Thank me once we've actually won something. Levi did not sleep, those first hours alone in the cell, though he made no particular effort to pretend otherwise once he heard Pratt's footsteps finally recede down the street. He sat instead with his back against the cold stone wall, turning the whole shape of the last 8 days over in his mind, unable to settle on which part of it troubled him most. The confirmation, finally, that his 3 years of chasing had led him somewhere real, or the fact that somewhere in the chasing, without his ever quite noticing the moment it happened, he had stopped being a man defined entirely by what he'd lost and started, instead being a man who had something worth losing all over again. That thought frightened him considerably more than Harlan Voss did. He had built a version of himself, these past 3 years, specifically designed to need nothing, and depend on no one, a man who could ride into any town, do what needed doing, and ride back out again with nothing left behind him that might be used against him later. It had been, in its narrow, hollow way, a kind of safety. Sitting in a cell on a stranger's lie, waiting for a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks to come find him in the dark, because some part of him had already, without permission, decided she was worth waiting for. He understood that whatever safety he'd built for himself past 3 years, it had quietly stopped being enough, sometime around the moment he'd first touched the brim of a hat and heard a soft voice say thank you. He did not know yet whether that realization was a gift or simply a more elaborate shape for the same old danger to wear. He only knew he no longer wanted to go back to not knowing it at all. She went to the rail camp that same evening, on foot, the half-mile out past the water tank, feeling longer than it ever had before. Bo Han was at the cook fire when she arrived, and he stood the moment he saw her face, some instinct in him already reading the shape of trouble before she'd said a single word. Mrs. Fong, I need your help, she said. Not for me. For all of us, if you'll hear me out. He gestured her toward the fire, toward the ring of tired, weathered faces watching her with the wariness. She recognized the wariness of men who'd learned the hard way that helping a stranger could cost more than it saved. She told them everything. The forged loan, the false arrest, the rumor about her deed, built out of nothing but the shape of a law that didn't even apply to her, spread anyway because it was useful to the man spreading it. Voss owns half this county because nobody's ever made it cost him anything to lie, she said when she'd finished. I cannot fight that alone. I do not want to fight it alone anymore. Silence sat around the fire a long moment. Then Bohan looked to his men, and something passed between them, without words, the kind of understanding built over years of being underestimated by people who'd never once bothered to ask their names. What did you have in mind? Bohan said. Bohan's crew numbered 11 men that season, and by the time Yulan finished speaking that evening, most of them had drawn closer to the fire, listening in a silence that had stopped being wary somewhere partway through her telling. A younger man near the edge of the group, Sammy Yi, one of the newer hands, barely 20 and still carrying the particular restlessness of a man who hadn't yet decided what kind of life he intended to build, spoke up first. My cousin worked a claim near Silver Ridge 2 summers back, he said. Lost it to a note that got renegotiated, twice in 1 year, each time worse than the last. Man who held the paper called himself something different both times, I heard the story told. Never thought much of it till now. A murmur moved through the others. Names surfaced, a cousin here, a friend of a friend there. Each story slightly different in its particulars and entirely identical in its shape. Bohan let the murmur run its course before raising a hand for quiet. "We are not citizens of this county," he said to Yulan, though the words seemed aimed as much at his own men as at her. "Cannot vote. Cannot testify in most courts that would matter, not against a white man, not and expect to be believed. Whatever we do here, we do it knowing the law will not thank us for it, whatever the outcome, I know," Yulan said. "I would not ask if I believed there was a version of this, where nobody had to risk anything." Bohan studied her a long moment, something considering and respectful in his expression. "Good," he said. "A person who pretends there's no risk is a person not worth trusting. You at least have the decency to ask honestly." He looked to his men once more, and this time the murmur that answered him carried something firmer in it, something closer to agreement than mere sympathy. "We will do what we can. Quietly and carefully, as you say. But we will do it. It wasn't much of a plan, not at first. Refused to sell through Voss's freight company. Refused to buy from any merchant who'd taken his side against her. Spread the truth of the forged ledger, quiet and careful, the same way Voss spread his rumors one word at a time, to people who'd trust the source. Small. Slow. The kind of resistance that wouldn't make a single headline anywhere in the county. Except Yulan had learned something these past weeks about the kind of power that lived in small things done together. A dime alone in a bowl meant nothing. A town's worth of dimes, withheld all at once from a man who depended on nobody ever adding them up, meant something else entirely. Sammy Yee stayed by the fire longer than the other men that night. Once Bohan's meeting had settled into quieter, more practical conversation about which merchants might be approached first and which would need more careful handling. "You aren't from around here either, are you?" he said to Yulan at one point, not quite a question. "San Francisco before this. China before that." She studied him a moment. "You?" "Sacramento. Born there, if you can believe a place like Sacramento produces anybody at all." A small self-deprecating smile. "My father laid track, same as most of these men, died doing it. Matter of fact, a rock slide up near Donner. 2 winters back. I keep at it because it's the only trade I know. And because somewhere in me I keep thinking I'll save enough to do something else. Someday, though I couldn't rightly tell you what. What would you do? If you could choose anything?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she'd expected. "Open a smithy, I think. Something that stays put. Tired of country that keeps moving out from under me before I've had the chance to learn its shape properly." "That is not so different from what I want," Yulan said. "Something that stays put. Something that is mine. And stays mine. Long enough to actually learn its shape." Sammy nodded slowly, looking into the fire. "Reckon that's most folks' whole wish, when you get down past all the particulars. Just a patch of ground the world agrees to leave alone." Neither of them said anything further for a while. The fire popped and settled, and out past the ring of its light, the desert stretched on dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, stubborn wishes of the people gathered at its edge, wishing anyway. The rail camp's fires had burned low by the time Yulan finally made her way back toward town that night, and she paused a moment at the edge of the light before starting the walk, looking back at the small, scattered glow of them against the enormous dark of the desert beyond. 11 men, an ocean, and half a continent away from wherever they'd first called home, choosing to stand beside a stranger's fight because the shape of her trouble was, in the particular ways that mattered most, indistinguishable from their own. She thought of her grandmother's stories again, not the magistrate's runner this time, but an older one, about a single reed that bent and broke under the lightest pressure, and a bundle of reeds woven together that could hold weight no single reed alone was ever meant to bear. She had spent a year believing herself entirely alone in Ashford Flats, standing at the edge of that firelight, walking back toward a town that held both her greatest danger and, increasingly, some of her steadiest allies. She understood for the first time in longer than she could easily measure that the belief had simply, quietly, stopped being true. 9 days remained. It was not very much time, but it was no longer hers to carry by herself, and that alone, she found, made the number considerably easier to hold. She found herself standing outside the jailhouse before she'd fully decided to go there that night, drawn less by decision than by instinct. A single lamp burned inside. She could see Levi's shape through the small barred window, sitting on the edge of a narrow cot, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. Lee said low, close to the bars. He looked up. Something in his face eased, just slightly, at the sight of her. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, "not with things the way they are." I am not alone, she said. Not anymore. She told him, quiet and quick, everything that had happened since the jailhouse door closed on him. Adlin's promise, Bohan's fire, the slow, careful shape of a resistance that had no name yet but was already, somehow, real. Levi listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat a long moment in silence, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite hope, but was close kin to both. 9 days, he said. 9 days, she agreed. That's not much time to build an army out of a hatmaker, a shopkeeper, and a rail crew that isn't even allowed to vote in this count. No, Yulan said. It is not much time at all. She stepped closer to the bars, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion and the fear, and underneath both of those, something steadier that hadn't broken yet, not even locked in a cell on a stranger's lie. But it is enough, she said, to make him afraid of what he cannot yet see coming. For the first time since the jailhouse door had swung shut behind him, Levi Whitlock almost smiled. Good, he said. Let him be afraid. It's about time somebody in this town made him feel it. There's something else, Yulan said, before she let herself leave the jailhouse that night, her hand still resting light against the cold iron of the bars. Something I haven't said. Say it then. I am frightened. The words cost her something to say plainly. After a year of practicing exactly the opposite of showing nothing, admitting nothing, letting the town believe her stillness was strength rather than the only armor she had left. Not only of losing the land, of losing this, whatever this is, between us, before it has had the chance to become anything at all. Levi was quiet a long moment, his hand coming up to rest against the bars near hers, not quite touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cold iron between them. I've been running 3 years, he said finally, low, chasing a debt that was never going to pay me back what it took. Didn't leave much room, in all that running, for anything else to catch up to me. He looked at her, and something in his tired eyes had gone entirely unguarded. For once, no sideways answers left in him. You caught up to me anyway. Whatever happens with Voss, whatever happens with this note, I don't intend to let that particular piece of ground go without a fight. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Then we will hold on to it together, she said. Both pieces of ground. The one with the spring on it and whatever this is, growing here, between two people who had no good reason to trust each other and did it anyway. He almost smiled again the second time that night, which she was beginning to understand was, for a man like Levi Whitlock, something close to an outright declaration. Both pieces, he agreed. Deal. Behind them, out past the edge of Ashford Flats, the rail camp's fires burned low and steady against the dark small lights, scattered, unassuming, waiting, all of them, for the morning. 9 days left. Marshal Otis Pratt did not sleep that night. Sat instead at his kitchen table, with a lamp burning low and a small tin box in front of him that he hadn't opened in 3 years, because he'd told himself, all this time, that he'd kept the paper for no reason at all. Just habit. Just a lawman's instinct to file things away instead of burning them. Except that was a lie, and he was tired of telling it to himself. He opened the box. The document inside was yellowed at the folds. Ohio, the header still read, plain as the day taken it, a land contract. The real one, the one drawn up honest. Before Harmon Steele's second visit, before the numbers changed and the interest grew teeth. Nobody had warned Amos Whitlock about. Pratt had been there the night the second contract got signed. Not in the room. Outside it, on the porch, nursing a leg that still ached when the weather turned, waiting for his old wartime friend to walk him back to town. He'd seen Steele leave a copy of the original behind by accident, forgotten on the porch rail in his hurry to get the new signature dry and binding. Pratt had picked it up, meant to give it back. Never had. Some part of him, some part that still remembered a man half carrying him 2 miles on a shattered leg had known. Even then, that a day might come when that paper meant more sitting in a drawer than it ever would hand it back to the man who'd left it. 3 years. He'd carried that instinct 3 years, and never once let himself look at it straight on. He looked at it now. He thought of his brother, of the note that covered his brother's gambling debt, the one with Pratt's own signature underneath it, the one that had turned him into exactly the kind of man he used to arrest, a man who looked the other way, because looking straight on cost too much. He thought of Amos Whitlock's hands, steady on that wagon strap at Sharpsburg, hauling him clear of a load that would have crushed him. He thought of Levi, sitting in a cell down the street, on a lie some paid stranger had Tudeholzer, and a wink from Harlan Voss. Except thinking wasn't the same as doing. He'd spent 3 years proving that to himself over and over, so he stood up, folded the paper back into its box, and walked out into the cold dark toward the jailhouse before he could talk himself back down into his chair. Levi was awake when Pratt's key turned in the lock, sitting the same way he'd been sitting most of the last few hours, elbows on knees, staring at a wall that had nothing on it worth staring at, except it gave his eyes somewhere to go that wasn't his own thoughts. Marshall. Wary. Careful. Bit early for visiting hours. Come to let you out. Pratt didn't meet his eyes at first. Set the small tin box down on the cot beside him instead. And to give you something I should have given you 3 years back. Levi opened the box, went very still when he saw what was inside. This is the real contract. Before Steele's second visit, Pratt's voice had gone rough. I've had it since the night your father signed the false one. Told myself all kinds of reasons for keeping it quiet. He shook his head slowly. None of them held up. Not really. Not once I let myself look at them straight. Levi's hands were shaking on the paper, and he didn't try to hide it. Why now? Because a lie doesn't get less heavy just for sitting in a drawer a long time. Pratt met his eyes finally. And because I watched a woman stand up to Harlan Voss, with nothing but a broken table and a spine made of iron, and it shamed me. Whitlock. Shamed me clean through. Watching her do the thing I've been too scared to do for 3 years. He reached for the Selkie ring at his belt, turned the second lock, the outer one, the one that mattered. Trumped-up assault charge won't hold up against a man with this kind of testimony standing behind him, Pratt said. Not once the state land office sees it. I'll swear to what I know, Whitlock, every word. The door swung open. You're free, Pratt said. Been free longer than either of us wanted to admit. Levi found Yulan at her table before the sunset fully cleared the ridge, and the sight of him walking down the street, unshackled upright, the real Ohio contract, folded careful in his vest pocket, nearly buckled her knees where she stood. They let you out. Pratt let me out. His voice was rough. Gave me something too. Something that changes the whole shape of what we're standing on. He told her, quick, quiet, the words tumbling faster than his usual careful pace. The tin box, the years of vigilance. The real contract that proved, in Steele's own honest hand, exactly what the second forged version had stolen. Yulan listened, and something had been clenched tight for a full day finally, slowly, began to loosen. Then we have him, she said. We have a piece of him. Levi's jaw was tight. The ledger you found. This contract. Your notebook of names now, besides. 2 lies proven out of however many he's told. Across however many towns. He shook his head. It's not everything. But it's enough to start. Enough to start what? He looked at her, and something steady had settled into his eyes that hadn't been there in the jailhouse. Enough to finish this, Yulan. In the open, where the whole town has to watch. She thought about it a long moment. The kind of thought that moves slow and careful, the way you'd cross a frozen river, testing each step before trusting your full weight to it. No, she said finally. Levi blinked. No? Not you. She held his gaze steady. Me. Yulan. You have spent 3 years chasing this man with a gun on your hip and revenge in your chest, Levi. If you are the one who stands in that street and accuses him, half this town will see exactly what Voss wants them to see. A gunslinger settling an old score. Her voice didn't waver. But if I stand there, if a widow who has sat quiet and small in this town for a year stands up with proof in her hands and asks this town to look, that they cannot dismiss so easily. Levi was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone soft in a way she hadn't heard from him before. You're not small, he said. Not anymore. I don't think you ever were. This town just took a long while catching up to it. The 9 days that followed moved fast and slow at once. Fast in the doing, slow in the waiting, the particular strange rhythm of people building something together, while trying not to let the man they were building it against notice. Bohan's crew spread word quiet through the rail camps, up and down the line, other laborers. Other small merchants in other towns, men and women who'd carried their own version of Voss's forgeries and Voss's threats and never had the proof to make anybody listen. Some of them had proof of their own, more than Yulan had guessed. A letter here, a note with numbers that didn't add up there. Small pieces scattered across 100 miles of territory that had never before had anywhere to gather. Sammy Yee rode 2 full days to Elko and back, carrying nothing but a folded letter of introduction from Bohan and a willingness to sit patient in 3 different saloons until the right kind of conversation found him. He came back with the name of a rancher who'd lost half a herd to a Voss note gone suddenly, inexplicably larger than the figure he remembered signing for. The rancher agreed, after some persuading, to put his account in writing. Adeline Whitfield did her own work along the boardwalk, careful conversation by careful conversation, calling in favors she'd never once used in all her years of quiet, over-the-shoulder kindness. She started with the women, mostly wives and widows and shopkeepers who owed her small debts of their own, the kind built up over years of extended credit and quiet understanding during hard months. She did not call those debts due exactly. She only asked gently whether they might be willing to remember, out loud if ever came to that, certain things they'd once told her in confidence about their own dealings with the land office. Most said yes. A few said nothing at all, which Adeline understood, without resentment, as its own kind of answer. The boycott bit harder than any of them expected. Voss's freight company depended on regular business feed, tools, supplies moving in and out on contracts he controlled. Except contract by contract, quiet as a held breath, Mertens, who'd always used his wagons, started finding other arrangements. A rancher here, hauling his own hay for the first time in years, muttering something about wanting the exercise. A store owner there, suddenly remembering a cousin in Reno who ran freight cheaper anyhow. Nothing loud enough to summon Voss storming into the street demanding answers. Just enough, slowly, that his ledgers, the real ones, the ones he kept for himself, behind the false panel in his desk, started telling a story he didn't like. Old Kessler, of all people, proved unexpectedly useful. His feed store supplied half the county, and when he began quietly steering customers toward independent haulers instead of Voss's wagons, he did it with such an air of simple, practical helpfulness that nobody outside the small circle of the resistance ever guessed it was anything but ordinary commerce. "Man's owed me an apology since 1879. Kessler told Yulon once, gruff, when she thanked him for it. "This'll do." He works up the nerve to offer one proper. Even Ottilie Vance, in her own quiet fashion, began to waver. She did not join the resistance outright. Could not, she told Yulon plainly. One evening when the two women found themselves closing up their tables at the same hour for the first time in weeks, without risking the debt Voss still held over her. But she began, in small ways, to make herself less useful to him. A shipment of ribbon that arrived a week late through no fault anyone could quite trace back to her. A customer or two, drifting back toward Yulon's table, that Ottilie made no particular effort to win back. "I did not come west to be any man's instrument," she said, the one time she spoke of it directly. "I am beginning to remember that about myself. It has taken longer than I'm proud of." Yulon did not press her further. Understood, better than most, how long it could take a person buried under someone else's debt to remember they were still, underneath it, a person capable of their own decisions. Yulon saw the change in Voss himself before anyone else did. Small things at first. The wool suit a shade less pressed than usual. The smile arriving a half-second later than it used to, like he had to reach further for it now. A new tightness around his eyes that no amount of practiced composure quite managed to smooth away. He came to her table on the 7th morning, and for the first time since she'd known him, some of the smoothness had cracked loose from his voice. "Business seems slow, Mrs. Fong." His eyes were flat pale, searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. "Slower than usual all around town." "Is it?" she said, mild, unbothered, because she had learned, finally, the particular power of giving a man like Voss exactly nothing to grab hold of. "Strange coincidence," he said. "This close to your note coming due." "I have found," Yulon said, "that this town has a great many coincidences lately, Mr. Voss. Perhaps it is simply learning to see more clearly." Something flickered behind his pale eyes, the same flicker she'd caught the day he first noticed the scar on Levi's hand. Recognition, this time, of a different sort. The recognition of a man realizing, for the first time, that the ground beneath him had shifted, and he hadn't felt it happen. He didn't say anything more. Tipped his hat, the gesture a shade stiffer than his usual, practiced ease, and walked back toward his office. Yulon watched him go, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. By the 8th day, Levi's notebook of aliases had grown by 3 more names, each one confirmed by a writer Bohan trusted, each one another thread in the same long rope. Marshall Pratt spent those days quietly compiling his own account of the Ohio porch, writing and rewriting it late into the night, until the words matched, as closely as 3 years of memory allowed. Exactly what he had seen and heard. Marshall Pratt's account, once he finally began setting it down on paper in the days after his first conversation with Levi, did not come easily to him. He filled 3 sheets and discarded them all, dissatisfied each time with how thin his own words looked laid out plain against the weight of what they were meant to carry. He tried a 4th attempt late one night, after the saloon had gone quiet and the street outside his small office had settled into the particular stillness that belonged only to the deep hours before dawn. This time he did not try to make the words sound official, or careful or lawyerly. He simply wrote what he remembered, plain as he could manage the porch, the lamplight, Amos Whitlock's handshaking, as he signed a contract he did not fully understand, and Steele's easy, practiced smile watching him do it. He read the finished pages over twice before he allowed himself to feel anything like satisfaction in them. They were not elegant. They would never be mistaken for a lawyer's careful phrasing. But they were true, every word of them, in a way none of his earlier, more polished attempts had quite managed to be, and Pratt understood, folding the pages away for the night, that truth plainly told had always been worth more than truth. Dressed up to sound, important a lesson had taken him considerably longer than 3 drafts, and considerably longer than 3 years, to finally learn. He showed the finished account to Levi the evening before the deadline, hands not quite steady as he handed the pages over. Not much of a writer, Pratt said, apologetic. But it's honest, every word of it. Levi read it through twice, slow, and when he looked up, something had eased in his face that had been tight there since the night his father died. It's enough, he said. More than enough. Thank you, Otis. It was the first time he'd used the marshal's given name. Pratt seemed to feel the weight of that small shift, as plainly as Levi had intended it a debt, not fully repaid, but acknowledged at last, man to man, the way it should have been acknowledged 3 years earlier. The last night before the note came due, the wind picked up off the desert, carrying grit and the smell of fish through the open door of Yulan's small rented room. Levi came by after dark, the real Ohio contract still folded in his vest, the way he'd carried it every day since Pratt handed it over like a man afraid it might vanish if he let it out of reach. Tomorrow, he said from the doorway. Didn't come further in, not without being asked, though something in the way he stood there made it plain he'd have liked to. Tomorrow, Yulan agreed. You're certain? About doing this yourself? I have never been more certain of anything. She held his gaze. Except perhaps one thing. What's that? She hesitated, because the words that wanted out of her chest just then had nothing to do with ledgers or forged contracts or a town's worth of careful, quiet resistance. That I am glad, she said finally, that a tired man on a lame horse stopped at my table a few weeks ago. Whatever comes tomorrow. I am glad for that. Levi crossed the room in 3 steps, stopped close enough that she could see exhaustion in his face, had gone soft around the edges, replaced by something steadier.
I stopped, he said, because the work was good. I stayed.
He paused, swallowed, started again, quieter. I stayed because I didn't want to be anywhere you weren't. Took me longer to admit that than it should have. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Didn't need to. The wind outside kept moving sand against the walls, patient as anything, and somewhere down the street a lamp guttered out in Voss's office window, the last light on the block finally going dark. Morning came hot and still, the kind of stillness that sits over a town right before something in it breaks open. Yulan set up her table same as always, except this time she didn't lay out hats. She laid out papers, the real Ohio contract in Amos Whitlock's honest hand, the forged loan document, Kai's original numbers plain beside the altered ones in Voss's careful criminal script, Marshall Pratt's own written account, a rancher's letter from Elko, 3 more names in Levi's small worn notebook, and a short list gathered over 9 careful days of other towns, other families, other versions of the same lie told under the same false names. Adeline Whitfield stood at her shoulder. Bohan and 4 of his crew stood a respectful distance back, near enough to be seen, far enough not to crowd what belonged this morning to Yulan alone. Even old Kessler had closed his own store early to stand somewhere in the gathering crowd, arms crossed, watchful. Levi stood at the edge of the boardwalk, watching, waiting, hand nowhere near his holster. The morning Voss stepped out of his office and saw the papers laid across Yulan's table, where her hats should have been. He had already lost, though it would take him the better part of the day to understand that fully. Word moved through Ashford Flats the way word always moved fast, and faster once it started, until half the town had gathered along the street. By the time Harlan Voss stepped out of his office to see what the commotion was about, he saw the papers on her table before he saw her face, and something in his easy practice stride caught, just for a heartbeat, like a man stepping onto ice that had suddenly gone thin. Mrs. Fong. His voice found its smoothness again fast, but not fast enough. Selling something new today? The truth, Mr. Voss. Her voice carried clear across the gathered street, steadier than she'd known it could be. Free of charge, to anyone in this town willing to look at it. He laughed, short, dismissive, aimed more at the crowd than at her, a man trying to remind everyone watching exactly whose laughter mattered more. I'm afraid I don't have time for. This is your handwriting. She held up the altered loan document, the forged number plain and dark against the page. And this the real contract? Beside it, Amos Whitlock's honest signature, catching the morning light, is the original. Signed in Ohio, 3 years back, under a different name. Harmon Steele. The crowd's murmur shifted, sharpened. Voss's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating in a way the whole street could see now, once they knew to look for it. Wild accusations, he said. From a woman with a debt she can't pay and every reason to invent a story. Then explain the numbers, Mr. Voss. Yolande didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Explain why the figure my husband copied down the day he signed does not match the figure on your most recent notice. Explain it to this street, to Marshall Pratt, who has already sworn to what he witnessed on an Ohio porch 3 years ago. A ripple moved through the crowd at Pratt's name. He stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the jailhouse, badge catching the light, face set in the grim, steady way of a man who'd finally stopped looking the other direction. It's true, Pratt said, loud enough to carry. Every word of it. I've got the paperwork to prove it, and I've got 3 years of silence on my own conscience that I don't intend to carry a day longer. Voss's gaze snapped to him, something dangerous flickering there for just a moment. Otis, think carefully about what you're doing. I have thought about it, Pratt said. Every day for 3 years. Turns out thinking wasn't the hard part. Doing it was. Voss's eyes swept the crowd, and Yolande watched him do the thing he'd always done. Search for the lever, the weakness, the fear he could pull on to turn the room back in his favor. Yolande felt her own heartbeat loud in her ears as she watched the crowd's mood shift, and underneath the steadiness she'd shown Voss, a smaller, more private voice kept insisting this could still go wrong, that a year of practiced invisibility had taught her exactly how quickly a town's sympathy could curdle back into suspicion if given the smallest excuse. It did not curdle. She watched it hold instead, watched old Kessler's arms stay crossed and resolute, watched the rancher who'd first spoken up nod along grimly to every fresh grievance that surfaced from the crowd around him, and understood, with a clarity that settled warm and disbelieving in her chest, that whatever fragile thing she and Adeline and Bohan's crew had spent 9 careful days building, it had not been fragile at all. It had simply been quiet, the way real foundations so often were, invisible right up until the moment the whole structure they'd been supporting all along finally stood up and made itself known. She thought, in that strange suspended moment before Voss finally turned to leave, of the single dime that had once sat alone in her ceramic bowl. Thought of how impossibly far that dime felt now from the crowded, murmuring street around her, not because the dime self had changed, but because she had stopped believing, somewhere in the last month, that a single dime was all she would ever be worth to this town. This is absurd, he said, louder now, a note of real strain creeping into the smoothness. You'd take the word of a Chinese widow and a washed-up marshal over a respected businessman who has done nothing but build this town. You'd have taken mine too, once. A new voice cut through the murmur, clear and unexpected. Ottilie Vance stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the edge of the crowd, her fine dress and practiced composure looking, in that moment, considerably more like armor than decoration. I believe most of you know I've been renting a table across from Mrs. Fong's these past weeks, at Mr. Voss's kind arrangement. Her mouth curled around the word kind like it tasted of something spoiled. What most of you don't know is that arrangement came in exchange for a debt of my own one Mr. Voss offered to forgive, so long as I stayed useful to him. A fresh murmur moved through the crowd, sharper this time. I have watched this man work these past weeks, Ottilie continued, her voice gaining steadiness with every word, as though the saying of it were burning off some fog she'd been living inside. I have watched him smile at a woman with one hand while taking her livelihood with the other. I did not come west to be anyone's instrument, Mr. Voss. I find I am finished being yours. Voss's composure, already fraying, took a visible blow at that, not from a stranger this time, not from an old grievance he might have dismissed as ancient history, but from a woman he had, until that very moment, considered entirely under his control. Ottilie, he started. Low warning. Miss Vance, she corrected, cool as anything. And I believe, Mr. Voss, that you no longer have any claim on what I choose to call myself or anyone else. Built it on other people's land, a voice called from the crowd. A rancher, the same man who'd bought 2 hats the first day, brother included. Built it on my note too, Voss. And I've been wondering a long while why the numbers on that thing never seemed to shrink no matter how much I paid down. Another voice joined. Then another. Small complaints, old grievances, years of quiet unease finally finding a reason to speak out loud all at once. The way water finds a crack in a dam and widens it faster than anyone expects. The crowd's mood, already turning, turned harder still after that. It was one thing for a widow and a marshal to level an accusation, however well supported. It was another thing entirely for the very woman Voss had installed, as competition, to stand up in the middle of the street and confirm, in her own voice, exactly the shape of the game he'd been playing. Bohan's men, standing their respectful distance back, exchanged glances that carried something close to grim satisfaction. Sammy Yee, at the edge of the group, allowed himself the smallest of smiles the first Yulon had seen on him since the night by the fire. When he'd spoken of wanting a patch of ground the world agreed to leave alone. Even Marshal Pratt, standing firm despite the weight of 3 years' guilt still visibly heavy on him, seemed to stand a fraction straighter, as though Ottilie's courage had lent him some of its own. Voss looked out over the gathered street, the rancher who'd spoken up, the merchants who'd quietly turned their business elsewhere these past 9 days. Kessler, with his arms crossed and his old grievance finally spoken aloud in the set of his jaw. Ottilie standing tall and unbought at last, and understood, in the particular way a man understands a losing hand only once every card is already on the table, that there was no smile left in his arsenal capable of turning this particular room back in his favor. Yulon felt it happen, the shift in the street, subtle at first and then unmistakable, the whole weight of the town's attention turning away from Voss's practiced smile and toward the papers on her table, toward the truth laid out plain enough that even people who'd never wanted to look at her before couldn't help but look now. Voss felt it too. She watched him feel it, watched the polish crack fully off his face for the first time since she'd known him, revealing something underneath that was smaller, meaner, and considerably more frightened than the man who'd stood over her table a year ago and mentioned her husband's grave like a threat. "You'll regret this," he said. Low. Aimed at her alone now, the crowd forgotten for one raw, ugly second. "All of you. This town needs me more than you understand." "No," Yulon said. Simple, final. "I do not think it does. I think it simply forgot for a while that it did not." Levi moved then. Stepped off the boardwalk. Closed the distance between himself and Voss with the same unhurried, economical stride he'd used the day he crossed the street to buy a hat that had started all of this. The crowd went quiet, bracing. The way a crowd braces when a man with a gunslinger's reputation walks toward the man who'd once stolen everything from his family. Voss's hand twitched toward nothing. He wore no weapon, hadn't in years, had never needed one when paper did the same work quieter, and something like real fear crossed his face for the first time. Levi stopped a few feet away. Close enough. Not too close. 3 years, Levi said. Quiet enough that only the nearest rows of the crowd caught it. 3 years, I pictured this moment. Pictured a lot of ways it might go. "Whitlock, I'm not going to hit you." Levi's voice stayed level. "Wanted to for a long time. Wanted it bad enough some nights it kept me awake." He shook his head slowly. "But my father built things, barns, fences, a life, board by board with these same hands." He held up his scarred left knuckles. "Let them catch the light. You took that from him with a piece of paper. I'm not going to hand you the satisfaction of taking something from me the same cheap way, turning me into exactly the kind of man you've always been. Paper beat my father. Let the truth beat you instead." Voss stood there a long moment, the whole street watching, no smile left anywhere on his face to hide behind. Then, without another word, he turned, walked back toward his office, shoulders bowed under a weight that had nothing to do with the heat, and shut the door behind him. It wasn't the ending the old stories would have written. No gunfight. No dramatic reckoning at high noon. Just a man walking away from a truth too large to argue with anymore, and a whole street left standing in the sudden, startling quiet of watching him go. He did not sleep that final night any more than Otis Pratt had slept 9 nights earlier. He sat instead in his office long after the lamps along Main Street had gone dark, the false panel in his desk drawer open, the second ledger spread out before him under a single guttering candle. He read back through it slowly, every town, every borrowed name, every family whose foundation he had quietly dismantled and called it business. He did not feel shame, exactly, turning those pages. Shame required a kind of belief in the wrongness of the thing done, and Voss had spent so many years building his particular philosophy of the world that most people deserved exactly the misfortune their naivety invited, that he could not locate, even now, with the whole town turned against him, the door back into a simpler way of seeing things. What he felt, sitting alone in the dark with his life's work laid bare before him, was something closer to irritation, a sense of interrupted business. A widow and a drifter, and a marshal with a guilty conscience, had cost him, through nothing more than patience and paperwork of their own, a town he had spent the better part of a decade quietly building into his private kingdom. He would not make the same mistake in the next town. He told himself that, packing the second ledger into a small traveling case alongside what cash remained in his safe, already composing in his mind the shape of whichever name he intended to wear next. He left Ashford Flats in the deep hours before dawn, the way he had left every other town before it, quiet, unhurried, already 3 steps removed in his own mind from the wreckage behind him. He did not look back at the fine glass window he'd shipped in special from Sacramento. Some part of him understood, even then, that looking back was a luxury reserved for men who intended to carry their failures forward as lessons rather than simply outrunning them, and Harlan Voss, whoever he might call himself, by the time he reached his next destination, had never once in all his years of vanishing learned how to do the former. He was gone by morning. Nobody saw him leave. Exactly sometime in the deep hours before dawn, a wagon loaded light and fast, the fine glass window of his office left dark and empty behind him. He'd taken what cash he could carry and left the rest of his holdings to whatever the state land office decided to do with a man who'd fled ahead of a fraud investigation. Marshal Pratt filed the formal complaint that same week, backed by the ledger, the Ohio contract, and a growing list of other towns willing to add their own stories once they heard Ashford Flats had finally found the nerve to speak first. Voss's name would surface again, months later, under some other alias in some other territory, the same pattern repeating itself the way patterns like his always seem to. But that was a story for another town to finish, not this one. This one belonged to Yulon. The formal complaint Marshal Pratt filed that week ran to 11 pages by the time he finished it, backed by more evidence than any single document he'd filed in his 11 years wearing the badge. The state land office in Carson City took less than a month to respond, considerably faster, Pratt noted dryly, than they'd ever responded to anything before, which he supposed was simply what happened when a complaint arrived with a marshal's sworn testimony, a forged ledger, and 6 separate towns' worth of corroborating accounts attached to it. An investigator arrived by stage some weeks later, a tired, thorough man named Whitcomb, who spent 4 days in Schwad Flats taking statements from anyone willing to give one. Old Kessler gave his account without hesitation. The rancher from Elko rode 2 days to give his in person, having decided, once the tide had turned, that he preferred to be remembered as a man who'd stood up, rather than one who'd merely written a letter and stayed home. Ottilie Vance gave hers as well, plainly and without flinching, and asked, at the end of it, whether the investigation might extend far enough to recover anything at all of the debt Voss had used to bind her to him in the first place. Whitcomb made no promises, but wrote her account down carefully all the same, and told her before he left that testimony like hers was precisely the kind that turned a scattered handful of grievances into a case a court could actually act on. By winter, word came back that a warrant had been issued for a man answering to several names, Harlan Voss among them, Harmon Steele among them, 3 others besides, that nobody in Ashford Flats had ever heard spoken aloud before Whitcomb's visit. Whether the warrant would ever catch up to the man it named, nobody in town could say with certainty. But the note on Yulon's land was voided outright, the water rights secured properly in her name at last, and that for the town that had lived so long under Voss's quiet thumb felt very much like winning. Whatever eventually became of the man himself. News of Ashford Flats traveled further than anyone in town expected, carried along the rail line the way news always traveled fastest through the mouths of firemen and brakemen and conductors who repeated a good story at every stop between one water tank and the next. By the following spring, two other towns along the same stretch of track had sent quiet inquiries to Marshal Pratt, asking after the particulars of how a scattered handful of grievances had finally been gathered into something a state office couldn't ignore. Pratt answered each letter personally, laying out plainly what had worked and what hadn't, never once claiming more credit for himself than he felt he'd honestly earned. "Wasn't my doing mostly," he wrote in one such letter, a copy of which Adeline kept pinned behind her counter for years afterward, "was a woman with a hat table and more courage than the rest of us combined, who taught a town it didn't have to keep looking away, just because looking away was easier." Yulon never saw most of those letters. Would likely have been embarrassed by the praise in them had she read it. She had never thought of herself as teaching the town anything, only as refusing, finally, to let the town's silence become her own. But the letters kept arriving anyway, from towns she'd never visit and people she'd never meet, each one carrying some small variation of the same grateful question: how did you do it? And could we do it too? Yulon visited Kai's grave the week the note was formally voided, and found herself, for the first time in over a year, able to stand there without the visit undoing her entirely. She brought no flowers. There were none worth the name growing wild in that dry country, but she brought the deed itself, unfolded, the faded ink of his small hand-drawn map catching the pale winter light. "We kept it," she told him, quiet, the way she sometimes still spoke to him when she was certain no one else was near enough to hear. "The land, the spring, all of it, exactly as you meant it to be kept." She stood a long while in the cold, the wind moving soft across the rise, and did not notice Levi's approach until his shadow fell alongside her own. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said. "Saw you walking this way. Wanted to make sure she weren't carrying it alone is all. Not today. You are not intruding." She looked at him, and something in her chest, some old careful guardedness, eased a fraction further than it had eased before. "I would like you to meet him in whatever way a person can meet a grave." Levi removed his hat, the same hat, weathered now, that had started all of this, and stood beside her a long moment in respectful silence. "Man raised a good wife," he said finally, "simple and plain. Whatever else I never got the chance to know about him. I know that much for certain." Yulon felt her eyes sting, though the tears that came this time carried less grief in them than gratitude. "He would have liked you," she said. "I think." He did not warm to strangers easily, but he valued honest work above nearly everything else, and I have never once seen you do a dishonest thing since the day you first stopped at my table. Told a whole town my name was Roan Colby for the better part of 2 weeks. That was a name, not a lie." She considered. "A man is allowed to arrive somewhere new still deciding who he intends to be." Levi looked at her a long moment, something unguarded and entirely warm moving behind his tired eyes. "Reckon I decided," he said quietly. "Somewhere around a table with 4 unwanted hats on it." They stood together a while longer at the grave, saying nothing further, needing nothing further said, and when they finally turned to walk back down toward town, Yulon folded the deed carefully away and did not feel, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that she was carrying it alone. 3 months later, the first chill of autumn had settled properly over Ashford Flats. The relentless summer heat had finally broken, and the dust on the main street kicked up soft instead of choking now, carried on a wind that smelled faintly of wood smoke and coming winter. On the corner where Yulon Fong had once sat with 4 unwanted hats and a single lonely dime, there stood a proper shop now. Fresh paint, a hand-lettered sign hung above the door, simple and clean. Fong's Millinery. Inside, the shop smelled of cured reeds and canvas and leather. Rows of hats lined along shelves built by hands Yulon had come to know as well as her own wide-brimmed styles for ranchers, rounder crowns for townsmen, smaller, stylish brims for the women who'd once hurried past her table without a glance, and now came as far as Carson City to be fitted proper. The hats had become something more than headwear in Ashford Flats. Wearing one meant something now, a quiet marker of a town that had eventually chosen honesty over comfort, even when comfort would have been easier. Adeline Whitfield's own note, it turned out, had been resting on the very same crooked foundation as half the town's a discovery that came to light only once Whitcomb's investigation began, pulling every thread Voss had ever left dangling. She wept. The day the state office confirmed the balance she'd been quietly terrified of. For 6 years had been forgiven, outright, wept in a way Yulan had never once seen her do, not even at her own husband's funeral. 6 years, Adeline said, when she'd recovered enough to speak plainly. 6 years I thought myself trapped by my own poor judgment. Turns out I was only ever trapped by his. She kept a hat of Yulan's on prominent display in her store window after that, no apron required to hide the purchase, no careful glance over her shoulder. It became, in its own quiet way, a small local landmark, the first hat any visitor to Ashford Flit saw, framed proudly in the dry goods store's front window, long before they ever found their way to Fong's millinery itself. Bohan's crew finished the spur line that winter and moved on, as rail crews always eventually did, toward whatever stretch of track needed laying next. But 3 of his men stayed behind, Sammy Yee among them, who used the last of his saved wages, together with a small loan Adeline extended without a second thought, to open the smithy he'd spoken of that night by the fire. It's at 2 doors down from Fong's millinery, close enough that the 2 shopkeepers took to sharing meals some evenings. 2 people who had both, in their own separate ways, finally found a patch of ground the world had agreed to leave alone. Marshal Otis Pratt kept his badge, though something in the way he wore it had changed, a little less careful, a little more willing, in the months that followed, to look a hard thing straight on rather than around. He visited Fong's millinery most weeks, not always to buy anything, sometimes only to sit a while and talk with the 2 people who had, in their own way, given him back a piece of himself he'd thought lost somewhere on an Ohio porch 3 years earlier. Pratt resigned his post the following autumn, not from any scandal or lingering shame, but simply because he had decided, in the quiet months since Voss's flight, that a man who had spent 3 years failing to act on his own conscience owed himself the chance to find out what he might do with the years remaining to him, unburdened by a badge that had come, in his own mind, to represent more compromise than justice. He took up ranching instead, on a modest spread outside town, and made a point of paying every debt he owed, his brothers included, settled slow and honest, 1 season's earnings at a time, before he allowed himself to call any of it truly his own. He never fully forgave himself. For the 3 years of silence, Yulan came to understand, in the quiet conversations they shared over the years that followed. But he stopped eventually, letting that unforgiven weight define the whole of who he was, and that, he told her once, was likely the most any man in his position could reasonably hope for. The shop, once it opened proper that autumn, drew visitors Yulan could not have imagined a year earlier. The Delgado boy came by often, no longer gangly exactly, having filled out some over the intervening months into the shape of a young man rather than a boy, and took to sweeping the front steps some mornings without being asked. The same quiet, unbidden kindness Levi himself had once shown her table leg. Constance Hale's niece from Reno wrote ahead one autumn to request a hat made custom to her own particular specifications, the first mail-order commission Fong's millinery had ever received, and Yulan spent 2 full evenings on the brim alone, determined that the very first piece to travel beyond Ashford Flat's own borders should carry every bit of care her hands were capable of giving it. Even Constance Hale herself returned, some months on, no longer trailing the suspicious reluctance of her first visit. She bought 3 hats that day, 1 for herself, 1 for her husband. 1, she admitted a little sheepishly, simply because the workmanship had become, in her own words, the only thing worth bragging about to her sister in Sacramento. Took me an embarrassingly long while to see what was plain in front of me the whole time, she told Yulan, counting out her coins without a trace of her old suspicion. Figured I owed you the saying of it, even if it's a year and some late. It is never too late to see clearly, Yulan told her. I have learned that much myself this past year. Levi stood behind the counter most afternoons, helping a rancher choose between 2 styles, with the same careful attention he'd once given a saddle strap in need of mending. He wasn't the weary drifter who'd ridden into town on a lame horse and a made-up name. Hadn't been for a good while now. He still carried the real Ohio contract, folded soft with handling, in the same vest pocket. Not out of grief anymore. Out of something closer to remembrance, proof that the thing worth building could survive, even after a thing worth loving got stolen away. Yulan worked in the back room most days, her nimble fingers weaving reeds with a quiet contentment that had replaced the fear that used to live in that same space. The worry that had followed her every waking hour for a year was gone now, and its absence still surprised her some mornings, like reaching for a weight that was no longer there to carry. She was a partner in a respected business, a woman the whole town greeted by name on the street now, without hesitation, without the careful, apologetic glance over the shoulder that had once colored even Adeline Whitfield's kindness. And with the note paid clear and the water rights properly secured, the land north of town, Kai's land, the spring he'd marked in faded ink on the back of a deed, had become one of the most valuable plots in the county. Levi took to riding out to the north pasture, some mornings before the shop opened, checking the boundary the way Kai once had, the way he'd learned Kai used to, from the stories Yulan told him over slow evenings when the work was done, and there was nothing left to do but talk. He never claimed to be walking in a dead man's footsteps, exactly. He was careful about that. Careful in the particular way. He seemed to be careful about most things that mattered. But he understood, without needing it explained to him twice, that a piece of land marked by one man's careful attention deserved to go on being marked that way, regardless of whose hands did the marking. Spring's running strong, he told Yulan one morning, coming back dust-covered and satisfied. Deeper than I'd have guessed. Kai always said it would outlast every dry summer this county ever threw at it. She smiled, something soft and unguarded crossing her face. He was rarely wrong about the land. It was people he had less patience for predicting. Man, sounds like he had good sense then. Levi set his hat on its peg by the door, his hat now, though it had started, in some sense, as hers, or as the thing that first brought the two of them together, depending on how a person chose to measure such beginnings. About the land and about people both, seems to me. Yulan laughed at that, a full, easy sound that had taken her the better part of a year to fully recover, since the accident that had first taken it from her. You have grown fond of a dead man's opinions, Levi Whitlock. Figure I owe him that much courtesy, Levi said, simple. Man built something worth this much care. Least I can do is go on tending it the way he'd have wanted. She said nothing further to that, only reached to straighten his collar, where the ride had left it crooked, and while small gestures, gratitude words might have made clumsy. It was Levi who raised the matter first, one evening that same autumn, not long after the shop had properly opened its doors, the two of them sitting together over the last of the tea once the day's business had settled into quiet. Been thinking on something, he said, turning his empty cup slow between his fingers, the same careful habit she'd come to know so well. Man doesn't rightly know how to say a thing like this without it coming out clumsy, so I'll just say it plain and let you sort the clumsiness out afterward, if there's any to sort. You may say most things plainly to me by now, Levi. I believe we've established that between us. He set the cup down, looked at her the way he'd looked at her that very first morning at her table, except nothing tired or hollowed out remained in his eyes now, only something clear and certain that had taken the better part of a year to fully surface. I came into this town chasing a ghost, he said. Spent 3 years before that letting the chasing be the whole shape of my life, because it was easier, I think, than sitting still long enough to want anything else. Then I stopped at a table with 4 hats on it, and somewhere between that first one and this last winter, I found I'd stopped wanting to chase anything at all. Found I just wanted to stay. Here. With you. However long you'd have me. Yulan felt something in her chest open all at once. A warmth she had not let herself fully trust in the year since Kai's death, blooming now without the caution she'd have applied to it even a season earlier. I have wanted that, she said. Quiet for longer than I have let myself admit out loud. I did not think, after Kai, that I would want it again. I am glad to have been wrong. He reached across the small table and took her hand, his scarred fingers folding careful around hers. The same gentleness she'd first noticed. He gathered her scattered coins out of the dirt. Then I'd like to ask you properly, he said, once a decent interval's passed and it won't scandalize the whole county to hear it, whether you'd consider making this partnership a formal one, not just the shop. All of it. Ask me in spring. Yulan's, smiling, unhurried and entirely her own. When the land shows its green again, and the spring runs full the way Kai always said it would. I find I would like an answer like that to arrive alongside new growth, rather than in the dead of winter. Spring then. Levi agreed, and brought her hand up to press, once, warm and certain, against his lips. I've waited 3 years chasing the wrong thing, Yulan Fong. Reckon I can manage one more season waiting for the right one. At the end of the day, After the last customer had gone and the shop had settled into its evening quiet, Levi came into the back room and stood a moment just watching her work, the way he'd learned to do without either of them needing to fill the silence with anything. On a wooden peg by the door hung the first hat he'd ever bought from her, weathered now, sweat-stained, its brim softened from a season of hard use. The hat that had started everything. The simple purchase that had unraveled a web of lies and, somewhere along the way, forged something neither of them had gone looking for. He walked over, picked up a stray piece of reed that had fallen to the floor, rolled it slow between his thumb and forefinger. "Nights are getting colder," he said. Yulan looked up from her work. A small smile touched her mouth, unhurried, entirely her own. She met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw not a gunslinger, not a drifter chasing a name that wasn't his, but a man who had finally stopped running. A man who had found at long last a place worth staying still for. "Yes," she said softly. "They are." They had built something real, not out of grand speeches or fiery declarations, but out of shared work, quiet respect, and the simple, stubborn courage to trust each other when almost nothing in the world had given either of them reason to. In a town that had once looked straight through her, Yulan Fong stood now in the doorway of a shop that bore her name, beside a man who had ridden in wearing her hat and left wearing, instead, a life he'd chosen on purpose. Outside, the last light of autumn folded soft across the street, and the sign above the door caught it plain and steady. Fong's Millinery. Open for business, same as tomorrow. Same as every day after that.